My name is Elena Marlowe. I am 34 years old, and 11 months ago I discovered that my husband had spent 4 years signing my name to documents I had never seen, moving $212 million through a family foundation I did not know existed, while I drove a 6-year-old Honda Accord to a government office in Alexandria, Virginia, and made $91,000 a year catching other people's husbands doing exactly what mine was doing to me. If you are watching this in your car during a lunch break you are not taking, or in bed at 11 at night after telling your spouse you were already asleep, comment below where you are watching from, because by the time this video ends, you are going to understand precisely why I never sign anything I have not read 3 times, and why the last place my husband ever expected to see me stripped of my dignity was the East Room of the White House, under crystal chandeliers, in front of a 4-star general who had known my father for 30 years. Like this video, subscribe, and stay until the end, because what happened at 9:42 that night is the reason I still cannot look at a barcode scanner without smiling. 3 things were happening to me at once that year, and I did not understand any of them until they collided. The first was money. Not my money, the illusion of money. My husband, Nathaniel Whitfield, 36, came from a family that had owned textile mills in Rhode Island for 4 generations, a name that opened doors at country clubs and made maitre d's suddenly find a table. The Whitfield name was real. The Whitfield money had not been real since 2009. What was real in the spring of that year was a shell entity called the Whitfield Family Legacy Foundation, EIN number I would later memorize in my sleep, 4622100987, registered as a 5010/3 charitable trust, with a board of 3 people, Nathaniel, his mother Vivian, and a family attorney named Roland Pierce who billed $420 an hour to sign whatever Vivian put in front of him. The foundation had, on paper, $11 million in charitable assets. It had actually moved, through a rotating set of consulting invoices and a Cayman intermediary called Ashford Meridian Partners, $212 million in the preceding 4 years, none of which touched a single food bank, scholarship fund, or hospital wing whose name it was attached to. The second thing was a man named Marcus Webb, 41, a mid-level program officer at a defense contracting subsidiary, who had, 6 months earlier, wired $18,000 to a woman named Camille Duval for what his expense report described as consulting services rendered. I did not know Marcus Webb. I would come to know him very well. Because Camille Duval was, at that time, a 30-year-old former yacht stewardess who had been introduced to my husband at a Whitfield Foundation gala in Newport 18 months prior, and who had, by the time I am telling you this, been receiving a rented townhouse on Beacon Hill, $4,200 a month, paid for by an entity my husband controlled. The third thing was a phone call I received on a Thursday morning at 8:52 a.m., while I was standing at my kitchen island in a beige cashmere cardigan I had bought at a consignment shop for $31, holding a mug that said "World's Okayest Accountant" that my niece had given me as a joke 4 Christmases ago. The call was from a blocked number. A woman's voice, careful, almost apologetic, said, "Is this Elena Whitfield? I think you should know your husband is not who he says he is at this address." Then she hung up before I could ask her name. I did not know it then, but that was the moment Loop A opened, the $11 million foundation that was actually a $212 million laundering operation, sitting 3 miles from where I worked every day. I did not know it then, but that was also the moment Loop B opened, the affair, the townhouse, the $4,200 a month secret my husband was keeping behind a smile he'd been giving me every night at dinner for 6 years. And I certainly did not know, standing there in that ridiculous cardigan with cold coffee in my hand, that I was about to spend the next 11 months building Loop C, the plan that would end with a decorated United States Army general saying 6 words into a live microphone at a White House banquet that would be replayed 900 million times online. "Sir, it's her. Look at this." But I am getting ahead of myself, because you need to understand exactly how invisible I had made myself, and exactly how visible I was about to become. I met Nathaniel Whitfield on a Tuesday in September, 9 years ago, at a fundraiser for a maritime museum in Newport, Rhode Island, where I was working as a junior forensic auditor for a firm that had been hired to review the museum's endowment after a board member raised questions about missing restricted funds. I was 25. I had bought my dress off a clearance rack for $44. Nathaniel was 27, wearing a navy blazer with brass buttons that had belonged to his grandfather, and he found me standing alone by the shrimp cocktail because I did not know a single person in that room, and I have never learned how to make small talk about sailing. He said, "You look like you'd rather be doing long division." And I said, "I would, actually." And he laughed. The kind of laugh that made 3 other people turn around, and that was it. That was the whole trap. Though I did not know it was a trap for another 8 years. What I did not understand then, what I would not fully understand until a forensic accountant 3 miles from my own house started pulling apart wire transfer records, was that the Whitfield name I fell for was a name with no money behind it. The mills had closed in 1987. The family had been living since the early 2000s off a shrinking trust that Nathaniel's grandfather Ellery Whitfield had set up, and by the time I met Nathaniel, that trust had roughly $1.1 million left in it, split 3 ways among Nathaniel, his brother Preston, and their mother Vivian. Vivian Whitfield was 63 years old when I met her, and she had exactly one setting: superiority. Every conversation I ever had with Vivian Whitfield across 9 years began with her finding something about me that confirmed, in her mind, that I did not belong. My shoes, my haircut, the fact that I ordered the chicken instead of the fish because lamb is really the only correct thing to order at the Weishmere. Elena, everyone knows that. She said my name, always, the way you'd say the name of a temp who kept using the good stapler. Vivian had a favorite phrase, one she used no fewer than 40 times across the years I knew her, and I want you to remember it because it comes back at the end. Some people simply were not raised to understand certain things. She said it about restaurant etiquette. She said it about wedding seating charts. She said it, 3 weeks before everything ended, about a $212 million wire transfer she assumed I would never be smart enough to trace. Nathaniel's younger brother, Preston Whitfield, 31, had not held a job longer than 11 months since graduating from a small liberal arts college in Vermont that his mother liked to call very selective, and that had, according to public records I would later pull, an acceptance rate of 83%. Preston's contribution to every family gathering was a fully formed opinion about wine he had not paid for, delivered with total confidence, followed by a request for a loan he framed as getting set up properly. Finally, this time for real, a phrase he used at Thanksgiving in year 1, at my own wedding rehearsal dinner in year 2, and at a 4th of July barbecue in year 6, each time for a different failed venture: a artisanal mezcal import business, a fractional yacht ownership platform, and finally, most relevantly, a consulting arrangement with the foundation that turned out to be $61,000 a year for a job that required him to show up to exactly 4 board meetings and say nothing. And then there was Camille Duval, though I would not learn her name for another 6 years. When I met Nathaniel, Camille was 21, working as a stewardess on a 140-foot charter yacht called the Serendipity 3 that the Whitfield family chartered every August in Newport Harbor, a tradition Vivian described as keeping up appearances for people who matter. I shook Camille's hand exactly once, at our wedding, where she was working the bar because the family had hired the yacht's crew to staff the reception, since they already know how we like things done. She had poured me a glass of champagne and said, "You're a lucky girl," in a voice with no warmth in it at all, and I had smiled and thanked her, and thought absolutely nothing else about it for 6 more years. I want to be very clear about who I was during those years, because the version of me sitting across from Vivian Whitfield at those dinners was not stupid, and she was not passive. I had graduated from the University of Virginia with a degree in accounting and a minor in statistics, finishing 3rd in a class of 211. I had earned my CPA license at 24, and my CFE, Certified Fraud Examiner, credential at 26. The same year I started at the Financial Crimes Analysis Unit of the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, a job I got in part because of a man named General Everett Bardsley. General Bardsley was not related to me by blood, but he might as well have been. My father, Staff Sergeant Daniel Marlowe, had served under then Colonel Bardsley in the 82nd Airborne, and had died in 2003 in Fallujah when I was 11 years old, pulling 2 of his soldiers out of a burning vehicle before the second explosion. Everett Bardsley had personally driven to our house in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to tell my mother in person rather than let it come as a phone call, and he had, from that day forward, considered himself responsible for making sure Daniel Marlowe's daughter never wanted for a mentor. He wrote my college recommendation letters. He sat in the 2nd row at my CPA licensing ceremony in a full-dress uniform that made the entire room go quiet. By the time the events of this story unfold, General Everett Bardsley was 68 years old, retired from active command, but still serving as a senior advisor on financial intelligence and sanctions enforcement to the Department of Defense, with a security clearance and a reputation that made colonels stand up straighter when he walked into a room. He called me Ellie, a nickname no one else on earth was allowed to use, and every single year, without fail, he called me on the anniversary of my father's death, not to talk about my father, but to ask what I was working on, because he said the best way to honor Daniel Marlowe was to make sure his daughter was still sharp, still working, still exactly as relentless as her father had been in a burning vehicle in Fallujah. I tell you all of this: the mills that closed in 1987, the trust with $1.1 million split 3 ways, Vivian's 40 times repeated phrase, Preston's 4 failed businesses, Camille pouring champagne at my own wedding, and a 4-star general who called me Ellie, because every single one of these facts becomes a knife by the end of this video, and I need you to be holding all of them when it happens. For the first 5 years of my marriage, none of it mattered, because none of it touched me directly. I made my salary. Nathaniel made his, or claimed to, from a vague family investment role that never seemed to require him to be anywhere at any specific time, but that produced, mysteriously, enough money for a Range Rover, a house in McLean, Virginia, with 4 bedrooms and a wine cellar, and a lifestyle that never quite matched what either of our actual incomes could support. When I asked early on how the numbers worked, Nathaniel would smile that same fundraiser smile and say, "The family takes care of things, Elle. Don't worry about the math. Math is your job at the office, not at home." And God forgive me, for 5 years I let him say that to me. A forensic accountant, a woman trained specifically to notice when numbers did not reconcile, let her own husband tell her not to check the math in her own house. That ended on a Thursday morning at 8:52 a.m., with cold coffee in a mug that said "World's Okayest Accountant," and a woman's voice on a blocked number telling me my husband was not who he said he was. I did not tell Nathaniel about the call. I want you to understand that decision because it defined the next 11 months of my life. I have spent my entire career interviewing people who moved money in ways they should not have, and the first thing I always tell junior investigators is this: the moment you tip your hand, the evidence disappears. Spreadsheets get accidentally deleted. Hard drives get replaced under the guise of an upgrade. People who were sloppy for years become, overnight, meticulous. So I stood in my kitchen for 11 minutes after that call, holding a cold mug of coffee, and I did what I do at work. I got quiet, I got still, and I started making a list, in my head, of everything about my own marriage that had never quite reconciled. The Range Rover, financed through a dealership in McLean, had been paid off in full 18 months earlier, $31,400, in a single wire transfer, at a time when Nathaniel's family investment role had, according to the one W-2 I had ever seen from him, produced $42,000 of reportable income for the entire year. The house in McLean, 4,100 square feet on a half-acre lot on Balls Hill Road, had no mortgage on it at all, which I had always attributed to the family, the same 2 words that explained everything and nothing for 9 years. Nathaniel's phone, an iPhone he was unusually protective of for a man who left his laptop open on the kitchen counter without a second thought, had a passcode he changed 3 times in the 2 years before the phone call, each time with an explanation so mundane, "I keep butt dialing people," the fingerprint thing stopped working, that I had never once questioned it. That night, I made dinner exactly the way I always did, a chicken piccata recipe I'd been making since our 2nd year of marriage, and I asked Nathaniel about his day exactly the way I always did, and he told me about a lunch with Roland Pierce, the family attorney, about foundation business, boring stuff, nothing you'd find interesting. And I said, "Sounds boring," and smiled, and inside my chest something had gone very quiet and very cold. The specific stillness I recognized from 100 interview rooms where I had sat across from someone who did not yet know that I already knew. I did not open a single file that night. I did not touch his laptop. I did not call the blocked number back, because I already understood, from 9 years of watching guilty people behave, that the woman on the phone had wanted something from me: sympathy, an alliance, a reaction. And I was not going to give her one until I understood exactly what she knew and exactly why she had called me instead of a divorce attorney or a journalist. I went to bed at 11, next to a man who had just spent 2 hours describing a lunch meeting that, I would later confirm, had actually been a 3-hour closed-door session with Roland Pierce and an offshore fund administrator named Desmond Achterberg, flown in from Georgetown, Cayman Islands, specifically to discuss a wire that had cleared 9 days earlier for $4,100,000. I lay awake until nearly 2 in the morning, and somewhere around 1:30, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above our bed, I made the decision that would consume the next 11 months of my life. I was not going to confront Nathaniel, I was not going to hire a private investigator who might be sloppy or, worse, might be someone Vivian's attorney could later paint as biased. I was going to do to my own marriage exactly what I did 5 days a week to strangers under federal subpoena. I was going to build a case, quietly, completely, with enough documentation that when it was finished, there would be no argument left for anyone to make. Not Nathaniel, not Vivian, not a judge, not a jury, and certainly not a 4-star general standing 3 feet away from me under White House chandeliers, watching everything I had built collapse onto the man who thought I had never once checked his math. The first document I pulled was public. Every 501(3) in America has to file a Form 990 with the IRS, and every Form 990 is a matter of public record. I requested the Whitfield Family Legacy Foundation's filings for the previous 5 years from my own laptop on my own time, using a public records portal that logs nothing more suspicious than a citizen looking up a nonprofit, which people do every day for 1,000 boring reasons. What came back over 3 nights at my kitchen table after Nathaniel had gone to bed was a foundation that reported in its most recent filing $11,400,000 in total assets, annual grants of roughly $600,000 to a rotating list of institutions, a scholarship fund at a maritime academy, a wing renovation at a children's hospital in Providence, a conservation easement on Whitfield family land in Little Compton, and, buried in Schedule 1, a line item called Professional and Consulting Services that had grown from $110,000 5 years earlier to $4,200,000 in the most recent filing. No 501(3) foundation of that size spends $4 million a year on consulting unless something is very wrong, and I had spent 8 years of my career finding exactly this kind of wrongness in other people's paperwork. The consulting fees, according to the attached schedule, went to 3 entities: Ashford Meridian Partners, LLC, registered in Georgetown, Cayman Islands; Blackstone Ridge Advisory, a domestic LLC registered in Delaware, with a registered agent address that, when I searched it, turned out to be a UPS store mailbox in Wilmington, shared by over 4,000 other companies; and a third entity, Halloran Strategic Consulting, registered to an address in Providence, Rhode Island, that I recognized immediately because it was Roland Pierce's law office. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the same yellow legal pads I use at the Treasury Department, and I built what I call, in my professional life, an entity map, a diagram connecting every name, every address, every registered agent, every date of incorporation, drawn by hand because I did not trust any software that might sync to a cloud account Nathaniel could somehow access. By 4 in the morning, I had a structure that looked exactly like 11 other cases I had personally closed in my career at Treasury. A legitimate front entity, the foundation, real, charitable, doing enough real good work to survive a casual audit, layered with consulting fees paid to entities controlled by the same small group of people, which were then used to fund a lifestyle that had nothing to do with charity at all. I want to walk you through exactly how the money moved, because this is the part that took me 4 months to fully document, working nights and weekends, using nothing but publicly available records, my own bank statements as a married joint filer, and, I will admit this now, because it matters later, my professional training in exactly the kind of financial structuring that the Treasury Department exists to catch. The foundation would receive a legitimate donation from actual Whitfield Family Trust assets, from Vivian's social circle, from a genuine charity gala that raised real money for real causes, the same galas where I had once eaten shrimp cocktail alone and met the man who would become my husband. That money would sit in the foundation's operating account for a period of anywhere from 6 weeks to 4 months. Then, on a schedule that appeared random but was not, I eventually mapped it to Roland Pierce's quarterly travel calendar, which I obtained through nothing more sophisticated than the law firm's own publicly posted attorney bio page listing his upcoming conference appearances. A portion of that money would be reclassified as a consulting payment to Blackstone Ridge Advisory or Halloran Strategic Consulting. From there, the money moved to Ashford Meridian Partners in Georgetown within an average of 11 days, always in amounts just under the $10,000 threshold that would otherwise trigger a currency transaction report if it had gone through a domestic bank in cash. Though these were wires, not cash, which told me whoever structured this understood banking regulation well enough to be careful, but not well enough to be invisible to someone who did this for a living. From Ashford Meridian, the money came back into the United States in a form I can only describe as laundered in the truest sense of the word. Clean, reissued, unrecognizable from its origin, as family investment distributions into 3 separate accounts, One in Nathaniel's name at a private bank in McLean, one in Vivian's name at the same institution, and one, which took me the longest to find because it was not in a Whitfield name at all, in the name of a trust called the Harborview Discretionary Trust, whose sole beneficiary, according to a filing error I found in a Rhode Island probate court record that should never have been public but was, due to a clerk's mistake in 2019, was Camille Duval. I sat back from my kitchen table when I found that name at 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in January, 11 weeks into my investigation, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not heartbreak, not yet, but a kind of cold, clean recognition. The exact feeling I get at work when a case that looked like simple tax fraud reveals itself to actually be something structured, intentional, and years in the making. Loop A and Loop B were not two separate stories. They were the same wire transfer, moving through the same shell companies, funding the same double life, and I was the only person in the entire structure who did not yet know that both loops led to the same woman. The total, once I had traced every transaction across 4 years of foundation filings, bank records I was legally entitled to as a joint account holder, and property records for the Beacon Hill townhouse Camille Duval had been living in since the year after my wedding. The total came to $212,400,000, of which I could directly document, with bank routing numbers, wire confirmation numbers, and dated correspondence. 188 million of it. The remaining amount, I suspected, was sitting in accounts I could not yet see, accounts that would require exactly the kind of subpoena power that a private citizen, even a forensic accountant with a CFE credential, did not have. Which is the exact moment I understood I could not finish this alone. And it is the exact moment I picked up my phone, sat on the edge of my bathtub so the sound of running water would cover my voice, and called the only person on earth I trusted with something this large, this dangerous, and this personal. A 68-year-old retired 4-star general who had promised my dying father's memory, 20 years earlier, that his daughter would never face anything alone. General Bardsley answered on the second ring, the way he always did, no matter the hour, because 20 years of losing men in the middle of the night had trained him never to let a phone ring 3 times. "Ellie," he said, and I could hear him sitting up in bed, could hear his wife Margaret murmur something in the background before he covered the phone. "What's wrong?" It was not a question. It had never been a question, not from him, not since he had knocked on my mother's door in his dress uniform in 2003 and asked to come inside before he said another word. I told him everything. It took 40 minutes, sitting on the edge of my bathtub with the water running, my knees pulled up to my chest, my voice barely above a whisper, walking a retired 4-star general through an entity map I had built with a yellow legal pad and a public records portal. Ashford Meridian, Blackstone Ridge, Halloran Strategic, the Harborview Discretionary Trust, Camille Duval's name buried in a Rhode Island probate filing that should never have been public. He did not interrupt me once. When I finished, there was a long silence, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then he said 4 words that I have carried with me every day since. "You did this right," he explained, in the plain, unhurried voice he used to brief 4-star generals and freshman congressional staffers alike why I had done it right. If I had confronted Nathaniel, the money would have moved within hours. Offshore structures like Ashford Meridian could be liquidated and rerouted to a jurisdiction with no reporting treaty with the United States in less time than it took to drink a cup of coffee. If I had hired a private investigator, opposing counsel would spend the entire eventual proceeding attacking the investigator's credentials, methodology, and fee arrangement instead of the evidence itself. But a forensic accountant employed by the U.S. Treasury Department, who had discovered a potential structuring and laundering scheme through entirely lawful means, public 990 filings, a public probate record, and her own legally accessible joint bank statements, building a case with the same rigor she would apply to any federal subject, was not just credible. She was, in his words, uncross-examinable if you did every step the way I think you did. "There's a problem," I told him. "I can see 188 million of it. I can't see the rest. And I can't get a subpoena on my own husband as a private citizen, and I can't use my Treasury access to investigate my own family. That's a conflict of interest that would end my career and taint every piece of evidence I've already built." "No," he agreed, "you can't. But I know 11 people who can, and every one of them owes me a favor they've been waiting 15 years to repay." What General Bardsley did over the following 6 weeks, operating entirely through channels I did not ask about and he did not fully explain, was quietly connect my case, stripped, at his insistence, of my name as the original source, so that it would arrive at the appropriate desks looking like a routine referral flagged by an automated anti-money laundering system rather than a wife investigating her husband, to the FBI's International Corruption Unit, and, because of the Cayman Islands nexus and the potential for the funds to have touched sanctioned entities through Ashford Meridian's broader client list, to a joint task force that included agents from the Treasury's own Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, a division I did not work in and had never had contact with, which mattered enormously for the conflict of interest question that would otherwise have swallowed the entire case. "I want you to understand something, Ellie," General Bardsley told me, on a call 4 days after I had first confessed everything to him, his voice dropping into the register he must have used to brief soldiers before something dangerous. "The moment this becomes an active federal investigation, you cannot touch it again. Not the entity map, not the bank records, not one more late night at your kitchen table. You hand off what you have and you let it become somebody else's case file, or every defense attorney your husband hires will spend 18 months arguing that a jealous, jilted forensic accountant manufactured evidence against her own family, and I promise you, a jury will listen to that argument a lot more than either of us would like." I hated it. I want to be honest with you about that. I had spent 11 weeks becoming the world's foremost expert on my own husband's crimes, and I was being told to hand that expertise to strangers and go back to making chicken piccata and asking Nathaniel about his day. But I had spent my entire career telling other people exactly this same hard truth, that the case matters more than the satisfaction of holding it yourself, and I was not going to become a hypocrite in the one investigation that would define the rest of my life. So I handed it over, every page, every entity, every wire confirmation number, every probate filing, and then I went home, and for the first time in 11 weeks, I let myself feel something other than cold, clean focus. I let myself feel for exactly one night sitting alone in my car in the McLean driveway before I could make myself go inside. The full weight of what I now knew, that the man I had married for his laugh at a maritime museum fundraiser had spent 6 years funding another woman's entire life with money laundered through a foundation that used my own name, Elena Whitfield, listed as an honorary emerita board advisor, on every single one of its glossy annual reports. I cried exactly once, for exactly 11 minutes, in that driveway. Then I dried my face, checked it in the visor mirror until it looked like nothing had happened, and walked inside to a husband who asked, "Long day?" And I said, "The usual," and smiled. Because the next phase of this, the phase where I had to keep living inside a marriage I already knew was over, keep smiling at a mother-in-law who called me by my name like an insult, keep watching a mistress I had never spoken to receive $4,200 a month while pretending I did not exist, required a version of me that Vivian Whitfield, in 9 years, had never once had the imagination to suspect I was capable of becoming. The next 4 months were the hardest performance of my life, and I have sat across interrogation tables from men who lied to federal agents for a living, so I know exactly what performance costs a person. The first test came 2 weeks after I handed everything to General Bardsley, at a Sunday dinner at Vivian Whitfield's house in Little Compton, a white clapboard house on 11 acres that she referred to, without irony, as the cottage, despite it having 6 bedrooms and a boathouse. Vivian served a leg of lamb that night, and when I reached for the mint jelly, she said, loud enough for the table to hear, "Elena, sweetheart, mint jelly is really for people who didn't grow up eating lamb properly. You can just have it plain, it's not a judgment." It was, of course, entirely a judgment, the same judgment she had delivered in a dozen forms across 9 years, and I smiled and set the mint jelly down and said, "You're probably right, Vivian," in a voice so pleasant that Nathaniel actually reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, misreading my composure as forgiveness rather than what it actually was. A woman who now knew that the cottage Vivian was so proud of had its property taxes, $18,400 a year, paid directly out of Blackstone Ridge Advisory's account. The same shell entity funneling foundation money to Ashford Meridian, 3 weeks before every due date for the past 6 years. The second Vivian scene came a month later, at a Whitfield Family Legacy Foundation gala at a hotel ballroom in Providence, the kind of event where I had once stood alone eating shrimp cocktail 9 years earlier. Vivian gave a speech that night about the responsibility that comes with a name like ours, about stewardship, about not everyone understanding what it means to protect a legacy. She looked directly at me during the word everyone. I sat in the third row in a navy dress I had bought for $190, applauded at exactly the right moments, and thought about the fact that the gala itself had raised $410,000 that night. Real money from real donors who believed every word of Vivian's speech. Money that would, according to the pattern I had already documented for the FBI, sit in the Foundation's operating account for approximately 10 weeks before a portion of it reappeared as a consulting fee to Halloran Strategic Consulting, Roland Pierce's own law office. Vivian's fixed belief, the arrogance that had defined every single interaction I'd had with her for 9 years, was that a name could substitute for actual worth, that being born a Whitfield made her fundamentally, permanently correct about everything from lamb condiments to charitable stewardship. And it never once occurred to her, not for 1 second across 9 years, that the daughter-in-law she considered barely worth addressing by name was, at that very moment, the reason federal agents had already opened a case file with her son's name on the cover. Preston gave me 2 scenes of his own, and both of them, true to form, involved him asking me for something while contributing nothing. The first was at that same Sunday dinner in Little Compton, when Preston, 31 years old, wearing a quarter-zip sweater that cost more than my monthly car payment, cornered me by the wine cabinet and said, "Elena, so hypothetically, if someone needed a bridge loan, like a short-term thing, 40,000, maybe 45 for a launch, I'm doing this new thing. Direct-to-consumer, artisanal olive oil, single origin, from a grove I found in Puglia. It's going to be huge. Cal Rossi is doing something similar, and he's already got Erewhon carrying it. Would you and Nate be able to help out?" Just until the Series A closes, I asked him with genuine professional curiosity what the Series A valuation target was, and Preston blinked at me and said, "I mean, we haven't really nailed that down. It's more of a vibe-based raise right now," and I told him I'd have to think about it, knowing full well that Preston's olive oil venture would never see a single dollar from me. And knowing, with far more clarity than Preston had, that his $61,000 a year consulting salary from the Foundation board was already funding a lifestyle he had never once earned through actual labor in his entire adult life. The second Preston scene came 6 weeks later at a 4th of July gathering at the McLean house, my house, where Preston arrived 2 hours late, ate 3 plates of food he had not helped prepare or purchase, and then complained, within earshot of 4 other guests, that the caterer, hired and paid for by me, had definitely upcharged for the shrimp. I could tell, this stuff is not sustainably sourced. I know because of the olive oil thing. You get an eye for supply chains. He then asked for the second time in 6 weeks whether I had thought more about the bridge situation. And when I said the timing wasn't right, he sighed the specific sigh of a man who had never once in his life been told no by anyone who actually mattered to him, and said, "That's disappointing, honestly. I thought family took care of family." A phrase that would return to me with a very different meaning 4 months later, standing under White House chandeliers, watching a federal agent read Preston Whitfield his rights for accepting $61,000 a year in exchange for laundering money through a Foundation board seat he had never once earned. Camille Duval I saw twice more that year, though she never knew that the second time I was looking at her very differently than the first. The first sighting was almost an accident. I had driven into Boston for what I told Nathaniel was a work training, and instead spent the afternoon parked half a block from a townhouse on Chestnut Street on Beacon Hill, a 4-story brick building with black shutters and a wreath on the door even though it was July. A wreath, I would later learn, that Camille kept up year-round because she liked the coziness of it. I watched her come out at 2:40 in the afternoon in workout clothes that cost more than my entire outfit, get into a car service, and leave. I did not follow her, I did not need to. I already had the lease agreement, the $4,200 monthly payment, the entity that paid it. I simply needed, for reasons I am still not entirely proud of, and will not pretend were purely strategic, to see her face once, attached to a real address, a real life, a real wreath on a real door in July, before I finished building the case that would take it all away from her. The second sighting was at the Whitfield Foundation Gala in Providence, the same one where Vivian gave her speech about legacy. Camille was there, seated at a table near the back, introduced to other guests. I later confirmed by asking a caterer under a pretext. As a consultant with Halloran Strategic, she does event coordination for the foundation. She wore a dress I recognized from a boutique on Newbury Street. $4,000, paid for, I had no doubt, the same way everything else in her life was paid for. She caught my eye once, across the ballroom, and held it for exactly 2 seconds. Not guilt, not fear, something closer to curiosity. The look of a woman who had spent 6 years being told by Nathaniel that his wife was handled, "Don't worry about her, she doesn't ask questions." And then she looked away and laughed at something the man beside her said. And I understood in that exact moment the specific fixed trait that defined Camille Duval across every single interaction I would ever have or hear about regarding her. Opportunism, pure and total, a willingness to occupy any space she was given, without ever once asking what it had cost the person she was displacing. I went home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for the second time that year, not crying this time, just breathing, running through the entity map in my head one more time. Ashford Meridian, Blackstone Ridge, Halloran Strategic, the Harborview Discretionary Trust. And I thought about my father, Staff Sergeant Daniel Marlowe, pulling 2 soldiers out of a burning vehicle before the second explosion. And I thought, not for the first time, that the version of courage I had inherited from him did not look like fire. It looked like 4 months of smiling at a mint jelly comment, 4 months of watching a man ask me for a bridge loan I would never give him, 4 months of holding a stranger's eye contact across a ballroom without letting a single muscle in my face reveal that I already knew exactly how her townhouse was paid for, and exactly how much longer she was going to be allowed to live in it. The case moved forward without me, exactly as General Bardsley had warned it would, and exactly as it needed to. I was assigned, through channels I never fully understood and did not ask to understand, a single point of contact. Special Agent Renata Castillo of the FBI's International Corruption Unit, a woman in her early 40s with a voice so flat and unhurried on the phone that I sometimes forgot, mid-conversation, that she was describing a case that would end my marriage. Agent Castillo called me exactly once every 3 weeks, always from a number that showed up as unknown, always for no more than 4 minutes, always with the same opening line. Nothing you need to do, just keeping you informed, per the General's request. She told me over those calls that the Cayman intermediary Ashford Meridian Partners had a client list that stretched well beyond the Whitfield Foundation, that Treasury's FinCEN division had flagged the same shell structure in 2 unrelated cases in the preceding 18 months, and that a grand jury subpoena had been issued to the McLean Private Bank for full account records on Nathaniel Whitfield, Vivian Whitfield, and an entity called the Harborview Discretionary Trust. She never once mentioned Camille Duval's name to me directly, and I never once asked because I understood exactly why. The moment the case included evidence of infidelity, it became a story about a scorned wife rather than a story about $212 million in financial crime, and I needed the world, eventually, to see it in exactly that order. In late September, 7 months into everything, Nathaniel came home on a Wednesday, holding an ivory envelope with a gold-embossed seal, practically vibrating with an excitement I had not seen from him in years. "Elle," he said, "you are not going to believe this. Mother just got the call. We're invited, the whole family, to the Treasury and Defense Department's annual Financial Intelligence and National Security Recognition Dinner at the White House, the East Room. Apparently one of the Foundation's board connections finally paid off. Roland knows someone who knows someone." He said it with the specific pride of a man who believed, to his core, that proximity to power was owed to him rather than earned, and I smiled and said, "That's wonderful, Nate," and felt something settle into place in my chest with the quiet click of a lock finally turning. Because I already knew, though I said nothing, exactly whose connection had actually produced that invitation, and exactly why General Everett Bardsley had personally ensured that every member of the Whitfield family received a formal, gold-embossed invitation to an event honoring the very people who had spent 7 months building the case against them. What Nathaniel did not know, what none of them knew, was that alongside the family's 4 invitations, a 5th credential had been issued separately, under a different protocol entirely, to Elena Marlowe, not Elena Whitfield, for reasons that would not become clear to anyone at that table until 9:42 on the night of the dinner itself. I received a call from General Bardsley 2 days before the event, and for the first time in 7 months, I heard something in his voice that was not caution or careful strategy, but something closer to satisfaction. "Ellie," he said, "I need you to trust me on one more thing. Wear the navy dress and bring the credential I'm having couriered to your office Thursday morning. Don't tell your husband it exists. Don't even take it out of your bag until you're asked." If you have ever had someone you trust completely ask you to do something strange without explaining why, and you have done it anyway because that trust had been earned over 20 years, then you already understand exactly what I felt driving home from Treasury that Thursday with a sealed envelope in my bag that I did not open, sitting beside a purse that also held, quietly, permanently, the entity map I had drawn by hand 7 months earlier on a yellow legal pad. Ashford Meridian, Blackstone Ridge, Halloran Strategic, the Harborview Discretionary Trust. A map that was about to become, in exactly 9 days, the single most consequential piece of paper of my entire life. If you have ever sat inside a life you already knew was ending, smiling at people who had no idea what was coming, comment below the exact moment you knew. The phone call, the receipt, the look across a room, because I promise you, mine started with cold coffee at 8:52 in the morning, and if this story is already making your chest tight, hit subscribe now, because the next part is the part I still think about every single day. The final layer of Loop B, the layer I had not expected, the layer that turned a betrayal into something I still cannot discuss without my hands going cold, came 4 days before the White House dinner, in a call from Agent Castillo that broke her own 4-minute rule and lasted 22 minutes. She told me in the same flat, unhurried voice she used for everything, that the grand jury subpoena on the Beacon Hill townhouse lease had produced a document neither of us had been looking for, a private school enrollment form for a 4-year-old boy named Theodore Duval, filed 18 months earlier at a Montessori school on Chestnut Street, listing Nathaniel Whitfield under father, financial guarantor, with a monthly tuition payment of $2,100 routed through the same Harborview discretionary trust that had been funding Camille's townhouse for 6 years. I had known about the affair for 7 months. I had known about the townhouse, the trust, the $4,200 a month. I had not known until that Tuesday afternoon, standing in my own kitchen in the exact spot where I had once held a mug that said "World's Okayest Accountant," that my husband had a son. I did not cry this time either, though I want to be honest that it took everything I had learned across 9 years of forensic training to keep my voice level while Agent Castillo finished the call. What I felt instead was a kind of vertigo, the specific dizziness of realizing that an entire structure I thought I had fully mapped, every wire, every entity, every dollar, had one more room in it that I had never seen. A room with a child's drawings on the refrigerator and a name, Theodore, that Nathaniel had never once said aloud in 6 years of dinners, anniversaries, and holidays, where I had asked him, more than once, half joking, whether he ever wanted kids. And he had always said the same thing, "Not yet, Elle. Timing's not right." The timing, it turned out, had been right for 4 years, just not with me. I thought, standing in that kitchen, about every single dinner where Nathaniel had come home late from the office, an office I had never once visited in 9 years of marriage, an office whose address, I would later confirm through the FBI's own records request, did not actually exist as a functioning workplace, just a mail drop for Blackstone Ridge Advisory. I thought about a Father's Day 3 years earlier, when Nathaniel had seemed unusually quiet at brunch, and I had asked if he was all right, and he had said, "Just thinking about my dad," a lie, so smooth, so effortless, that I now understood it had probably been closer to the truth than either of us realized at the time. He probably had been thinking about fatherhood, just not the kind he was telling me about. I called General Bardsley that night, not Agent Castillo, because some things you can only say to the person who drove to your mother's house in dress uniform to deliver the worst news of her life. And I said, "Everett, he has a son. Nathaniel has a 4-year-old son with her." There was a long silence on the line, and then General Bardsley said something I did not expect. Something that steadied me more than any strategic advice he had given me in 7 months. "Ellie, I need you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to grieve the marriage you thought you had. At the same time, you finish burying the one that was actually happening. Both things are true. Neither one makes you weak." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, in the same driveway where I had cried exactly once, 11 minutes, 7 months earlier, and this time I did not cry at all. I simply sat in the dark, and I thought about a boy named Theodore who was 4 years old and had no idea that his existence was about to become public record in the East Room of the White House. And I made a decision, quietly, that whatever happened to Nathaniel, whatever happened to Vivian and Preston and Camille, I would make absolutely certain, through General Bardsley, through Agent Castillo, through every channel available to me, that Theodore Duval himself was never named publicly, never photographed, never made to carry the weight of a story that was not his to carry. Some closures, I learned that night, are not about vengeance at all. They are about deciding, in the middle of your own devastation, who deserves to be protected anyway. That was the true closing of Loop B. Not the affair itself, which I had understood for months, but the full shape of what it had cost, and the boundary I drew, alone, in a dark driveway, around exactly how far I was willing to let this go. I would expose the money. I would expose the fraud. I would let Nathaniel Whitfield stand in front of a room full of witnesses and answer for every dollar and every lie. But I would not let a 4-year-old boy become collateral damage in a war his father started. And if you are a parent watching this, or if you have ever had to draw a line between justice and cruelty in the middle of your own worst year, I think you understand exactly why that boundary mattered to me more than almost anything else in this entire story. Loop A closed 2 days before the dinner, though closed is the wrong word for what actually happened, because I did not witness it directly. What I received instead was a single phone call from Agent Castillo at 6:14 in the morning, breaking every rule of her own 4-minute, 3-week schedule, to tell me that a federal grand jury sitting in the Eastern District of Virginia had returned a sealed indictment the previous afternoon, naming Nathaniel Whitfield, Vivian Whitfield, Preston Whitfield, and Roland Pierce on 22 counts, including wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and, because Ashford Meridian Partners' broader client list had, exactly as Agent Castillo predicted 7 months earlier, connected to a separate sanctions evasion investigation already underway at Treasury, a count of causing a financial institution to violate the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The total amount named in the indictment was $209,100,000, $3 million less than my own hand-drawn entity map had calculated, a discrepancy Agent Castillo told me, with what I am fairly sure was the closest thing to a compliment she was capable of giving, was smaller than most professional forensic teams manage on a case this size. The indictment was sealed, meaning it existed, fully signed, fully authorized, sitting in a federal courthouse 40 minutes from my kitchen table, invisible to every single person it named. Search warrants had already been prepared for execution. The McLean Private Bank, the Providence Law Office of Roland Pierce, the Beacon Hill Townhouse, and arrest warrants for all 4 defendants were ready, pending only the operational decision of exactly when and how to execute them. That decision, Agent Castillo explained, in the flattest voice she had used in 7 months of calls, had been made 36 hours earlier, at a level of the Department of Justice well above her own authority, in a joint decision with General Bardsley's contacts at the Department of Defense. The arrests would happen in public, at the White House Financial Intelligence and National Security Recognition Dinner, in front of the exact community of donors, board members, and institutional partners the Whitfield Foundation had spent 6 years defrauding, deceiving, and using as cover. Why there? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Why not just arrest them at home, quietly, before any of this becomes a spectacle? Agent Castillo was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, it was the only time in 7 months she said anything that sounded less like a briefing and more like a person. Because General Bardsley specifically requested it, and because, frankly, the Bureau agreed with his reasoning. A foundation like this survives by attaching itself to legitimacy. Real charities, real galas, real donors, a real place at a real table of respectable people. The most effective way to end that kind of fraud permanently, to make sure none of these 4 people ever get a second chance to rebuild the same structure under a different name, is to sever that legitimacy publicly, in the exact room where it was built. It also, she added, makes it substantially harder for defense counsel to later claim any of this was manufactured or politically motivated, when it's executed transparently, with full documentation, in front of witnesses who include sitting officials, decorated military officers, and members of the press. I understood the strategy. I had built cases with exactly this logic, more times than I could count in my own career. The difference was that I had never before been the wife standing 3 feet away from the man in handcuffs. I asked Agent Castillo one more question before she hung up, the only question that had kept me awake more than any other in 7 months. Will I need to say anything? Will I need to testify, in that room, in front of everyone? No, she said. You won't need to say a word. Your credential will do that for you. And then, before I could ask what she meant, the line went dead, exactly the way it always did, and I was left standing in my kitchen at 6:19 in the morning, 2 days before the single most consequential dinner of my life, holding a phone in one hand and, in the other, without entirely meaning to, the same mug that said "World's Okayest Accountant," which I set down very carefully on the counter, because my hands, for the first time in 7 months, were shaking. I called General Bardsley an hour later, and he confirmed everything Agent Castillo had told me, adding one detail she had not: the credential arriving at my office the following morning, the one he had told me not to open until I was asked, was not simply a formality. It was a distinguished recognition credential, issued jointly by Treasury and the Department of Defense, honoring an individual whose integrity and professional rigor materially contributed to the disruption of a significant financial crime. Language deliberately vague enough to protect the sealed indictment. specific enough that when the moment came, no one in that room would be able to mistake exactly who it was describing. "Ellie," he said, "I have spent 20 years making sure Daniel Marlowe's daughter never had to face anything alone. I am not about to let you walk into that room as anyone's overlooked wife. You are walking in as exactly what you are, the reason this case exists at all." I did not have words for that, not right away, and General Bardsley, who understood silence as well as any man I have ever known, simply said, "Wear the navy dress, Ellie. I'll see you Thursday," and hung up, leaving me standing in my kitchen with 2 days left to live inside a marriage that had already, invisibly, completely, come to an end. The 2 days between that phone call and the dinner were the strangest of my entire life, because I had to spend them performing a version of normalcy so complete that I sometimes frightened myself with how easily it came. I picked up Nathaniel's dry cleaning. I helped Vivian over the phone choose between 2 centerpiece arrangements for a foundation event the following month, an event I knew, with absolute certainty, would never happen, because the foundation itself would cease to exist as a legal entity within a matter of weeks. I even, on the second night, sat across from Nathaniel at our own kitchen table while he practiced what he called the elevator version of a toast he was hoping to be asked to give if the evening allowed for informal remarks. A toast about family, legacy, and the responsibility of stewardship. Language so close to his mother's gala speech that I nearly laughed out loud and instead said, "That's lovely, Nate," and refilled his wine. Nathaniel's father, Bradford Whitfield, 71 years old, flew in from Palm Beach for the occasion. A man I had met perhaps a dozen times in 9 years of marriage, because Bradford had spent the last 2 decades of his life mostly absent from Rhode Island, managing family interests in Florida, a phrase that meant, as far as I had ever been able to determine, playing golf 4 days a week and occasionally signing documents Roland Pierce mailed to him. Bradford Whitfield had inherited, alongside his late father Ellery's shrinking trust, an entirely undeserved conviction that the Whitfield name still carried the weight it had carried in 1965, and he wore that conviction the way other men wear cologne, applied liberally, noticed by everyone, unpleasant up close. He arrived at the McLean house the afternoon before the dinner in a car service that Vivian had arranged and, I would later confirm, paid for through Blackstone Ridge Advisory, and the first thing he said to me, walking through my own front door, was, "Elena." Still keeping the numbers straight for everyone, I hope, a comment he clearly intended as some form of avuncular teasing, and that landed, given everything I now knew, like a small, exquisite piece of irony I could not begin to explain to him. That night, I laid the navy dress General Bardsley had specified across my bed, a floor-length column of midnight silk I had bought 4 years earlier for a Treasury Department holiday reception and had never had occasion to wear again. And beside it, in a plain manila envelope that had arrived by secure courier that morning, exactly as promised, a credential I still had not opened. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, looking at that envelope, and I thought about 11 months, from a cold mug of coffee at 8:52 on a Thursday morning to this exact moment, and I thought about my father, who had never once, in 11 years of my life, gotten to see me become the woman I was about to become. I opened the envelope. Inside was a laminated credential, the kind worn on a lanyard, with my photograph, taken, I realized, from my Treasury Department employee badge, meaning someone had requested it through official channels weeks earlier without my knowledge, and beneath it, in formal government typeface, Elena Marlowe. Distinguished Service Recognition, Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, U.S. Department of the Treasury, in coordination with the Department of Defense. There was a barcode printed beneath my name, small, unremarkable, the kind of thing you would walk past 100 times without a second glance, and I would spend the rest of my life understanding that this exact small rectangle of black and white lines was about to become the single most consequential object in the entire story of my marriage. The morning of the dinner, I woke at 5:40, though the event did not begin until 7 that evening, because I could not sleep past that hour no matter how hard I tried. I went for a run, 3 miles, the same route I had run nearly every morning for 6 years, past the same brick colonials with the same manicured lawns, and I thought, the entire time, about every single detail Agent Castillo and General Bardsley had walked me through in a final joint call 2 nights earlier. The operational team would be present in plain clothes, positioned discreetly among catering staff and event security, coordinated with the Secret Service and White House Protocol Office weeks in advance under a classified briefing that described the operation only as a coordinated law enforcement action involving invited guests. language vague enough that even the venue's own event coordinators would not know exactly what was about to unfold. The arrests would happen only after the recognition portion of the evening's program concluded, timed specifically so that the credential ceremony, my credential ceremony, would occur first, publicly, on record, before a single handcuff was produced. General Bardsley had been unusually precise about this sequencing on our call, and when I asked him why the order mattered so specifically, he said, "Because I want every person in that room to understand, in the correct order, exactly who built this case, before they understand exactly who it was built against." People remember the order things happen in, Ellie. I intend for them to remember this in the right one. By 4 in the afternoon, the house had the particular electric tension of a family preparing for an event they believed was purely celebratory. Vivian arrived at 3, already dressed, her hair freshly set, wearing a Chanel suit I recognized from photographs of a Whitfield gala 9 years earlier. Retailored, she mentioned twice, unprompted, because good pieces last, Elena. That's something people who understand quality already know. Preston arrived at 3:30, in a rented tuxedo that did not quite fit through the shoulders, already talking about networking opportunities and whether it would be appropriate to mention the olive oil venture if the right person asks what I do. Bradford held court in my living room for 40 minutes about a golf outing with a senator's chief of staff in 2011, a story I had heard 4 times before in 9 years and would, that evening, hear for the final time in my life, though none of us knew it yet. Nathaniel came to find me at 5:15 while I was finishing my makeup in front of the bathroom mirror and stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching me, and said, in a voice softer than I had heard from him in months, "You look beautiful, Elle. I mean that." I met his eyes in the mirror and said, "Thank you, Nate," and felt absolutely nothing, which frightened me more than anger would have, because it meant that somewhere across 11 months of yellow legal pads and entity maps and cold driveway tears, the marriage had finished dying long before I had consciously said goodbye to it. We left the house at 6 that evening in a hired car, Nathaniel beside me holding my hand in a way that would have meant something 4 years earlier, Vivian and Bradford in the seat behind us discussing which senators they hoped would be present, Preston in the 3rd row on his phone, and I sat with my small evening clutch on my lap, inside which, folded carefully, sat a laminated credential with a barcode that Vivian Whitfield, in 9 years of knowing me, had never once imagined I was capable of earning. The drive from McLean to Pennsylvania Avenue took 41 minutes in evening traffic, and I spent every one of them looking out the window at the lit dome of the Capitol in the distance, thinking about a phone call at 8:52 on a Thursday morning, thinking about my father in a burning vehicle in Fallujah, thinking about a 4-year-old boy named Theodore who would never know how much his existence had shaped the boundaries of what happened that night, and thinking, more than anything else, about the specific, quiet, unshakable calm that settles over a person in the final hour before 11 months of work either holds together or falls apart in front of everyone who ever doubted her. We arrived at the East Executive Avenue entrance at 6:47 in the evening, 13 minutes before the doors officially opened, and stepped out of the car into air that smelled like cut grass and distant rain, under floodlights bright enough to make the white stone of the building glow, and walked toward a long registration table staffed by 2 young military aides and a Secret Service agent checking names against a tablet. And it was there, at that table, under those lights, that everything I had built across 11 months finally, publicly, irreversibly began. Bradford Whitfield reached the registration table first, striding ahead of the rest of us the way a man does when he has spent 71 years assuming every line exists for other people, and he produced his invitation, the ivory envelope with the gold-embossed seal that had arrived at the McLean house 2 months earlier, and held it up to the young military aide behind the table with the specific flourish of a man showing off a winning hand of cards. "Bradford Whitfield," he announced, loudly enough that 3 other groups of arriving guests turned to look, and party of 5. "We're on the foundation list. Should be right at the top, I'd imagine." The aide checked her tablet, found his name, and smiled politely, checking off Bradford, then Vivian, then Nathaniel, then Preston, working down a list that had clearly been prepared weeks in advance from the Foundation's own submitted guest registry. When she reached my name, she paused. "I'm sorry," she said, glancing between her tablet and me. "I have Elena Whitfield listed as a +1 under Nathaniel Whitfield, but I'm showing that credential was already checked in through a separate registration channel about 10 minutes ago. Do you have a secondary form of ID or credential with you?" Bradford, who had clearly been listening, turned around with an expression of pure, practiced condescension, the exact expression I had watched Vivian wear for 9 years. apparently a trait that ran through the entire family rather than belonging to her alone, and said, loud enough for the young aide, the Secret Service agent beside her, and at least a dozen nearby guests to hear clearly, "That's absurd. She's my daughter-in-law. She's on Nathaniel's invitation. There's nothing separate about it. You are not on the list, Elena dear. Just come along with the family. No need to hold up the line over a clerical error." He said dear the way Vivian said my name, a word deployed as a small, precise insult, and I felt Nathaniel's hand tighten slightly around mine, embarrassed. Though whether he was embarrassed by his father or by me, I genuinely could not have told you in that moment. I stayed quiet. I did not correct Bradford. I did not raise my voice, or explain, or ask anyone to double-check anything. I simply reached into my small evening clutch, removed the laminated credential I had been carrying since the night before, and set it on the registration table in front of the young aide, exactly the way I had set financial disclosure forms in front of subjects during 100 prior interviews in my professional life. Without drama, without urgency, with the specific stillness of someone who already knows precisely what is about to happen next. The aide picked it up, read my name, read the line beneath it. Distinguished Service Recognition, Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And then, out of what I can only assume was standard protocol for any unfamiliar credential at an event of this security level, ran the small barcode beneath my photograph, under a handheld scanner clipped to the side of her tablet. She gasped. It was not a small sound. It was audible enough that Bradford stopped talking mid-sentence. Audible enough that Vivian, 3 feet away, turned her head sharply. Audible enough that I watched, in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, the young aide's professional composure completely dissolve into something closer to alarm, before she visibly caught herself. Straightened and turned to a tall man in a dark suit standing near the entrance to the East Wing corridor. A man I recognized immediately, in his dress uniform beneath a formal overcoat, as General Everett Bardsley. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet cluster of guests near the table. "It's her. Look at this." General Bardsley crossed the distance between them in perhaps 6 steps, took the credential from the aide's hand, glanced at it for exactly 1 second. I do not believe he needed to look at it at all, given that he had personally arranged for its creation, and then looked directly at me, past Bradford, past Vivian, past Nathaniel, and said, in a voice that carried the specific authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in combat for 3 decades, "Ellie, there you are. We've been waiting for you." He extended his arm, not to shake my hand, but in the formal, ceremonial gesture of an escort, and said, to the aide and the Secret Service agent both, "Miss Marlowe is walking in with me. Please note that in the credential log. I want you to sit with that moment the way I have sat with it every day since, because I need you to understand exactly what it did to the 5 people standing at that table." Bradford Whitfield, who 30 seconds earlier had loudly announced that I was not on the list, stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, watching a decorated 4-star general address his daughter-in-law by a private nickname reserved for exactly one person on Earth. Vivian Whitfield, who had spent 9 years telling me that some people simply were not raised to understand certain things, stared at the laminated credential in the general's hand with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before. Not superiority, not disdain, but the specific, dawning horror of a woman realizing that the person she had spent 9 years underestimating was standing exactly 3 feet away from the single most powerful man in the building. Preston, in his ill-fitting rented tuxedo, simply said, "Wait, what?" to no one in particular. And Nathaniel let go of my hand entirely, took half a step backward, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as a man watching the floor disappear beneath him in real time. "Everett," I said, because I had decided, in the car on the way over, that if this moment came, I would meet it exactly as calmly as I had met every single day of the preceding 11 months. "Thank you for waiting." "Always, Ellie," he said, and then, glancing once at Nathaniel, at Vivian, at Bradford, with an expression that had gone entirely, formally cold, he added, "The rest of the Whitfield party can proceed to check in as scheduled. There's a separate program element tonight that will require everyone's attention a bit later in the evening. I'd suggest enjoying the reception until then." We walked into the East Room together, General Bardsley and I, past 240 guests already gathered beneath crystal chandeliers I had seen only in photographs, past a string quartet playing something quiet and formal, past tables set with white linen and small gold placards, and he leaned toward me once, briefly, and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "You did the hardest part 11 months ago. At your own kitchen table, alone. Tonight is just paperwork. I laughed, the first real laugh I had allowed myself in months, and it came out sounding almost like a sob, and General Bardsley simply patted my hand once, the way he had at my CPA licensing ceremony a decade earlier, and said nothing else, because nothing else needed saying. The recognition portion of the evening's formal program began at 8:50, after dinner had been served and the plates cleared, when a Deputy Secretary of the Treasury took the small stage at the front of the East Room and announced, into a microphone that carried clearly across the entire hall, that the department wished to recognize an individual whose integrity, discretion, and professional rigor had materially contributed to the disruption of a significant financial crime affecting the national interest. He read a short citation, deliberately vague, exactly as General Bardsley had promised, protecting the still-sealed indictment even as it was about to become irrelevant, and then said my name into the microphone. Elena Marlowe, Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. I walked to the small stage, in my navy silk dress, past a table where Nathaniel sat rigid and pale, past Vivian, whose face had arranged itself into the practiced smile of a woman performing composure for 240 witnesses while privately unraveling, and I shook the Deputy Secretary's hand and accepted a small crystal award and said nothing except thank you, because I had learned across 11 months that the fewer words I gave a room, the more weight each one carried. I was still standing near the small stage, crystal award in hand, when the second phase of the evening began, at 9:42 exactly, a time I know precisely because I looked at my watch in the half-second before it happened, an old habit from years of documenting exact timestamps on financial transactions that meant something even in the middle of the single most emotionally overwhelming moment of my life. 4 plainclothes agents who had been standing, I now realized, near the catering staff entrance and along the west wall for the entire evening, moved simultaneously toward the Whitfield table. A 5th, in a dark suit I recognized as Agent Renata Castillo, walked directly to where Nathaniel sat, produced a federal badge, and said, in a voice that carried across a room that had gone almost entirely silent, "Nathaniel Whitfield, you are under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and violations of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act." 2 other agents moved to Vivian and Preston. A 4th approached Roland Pierce, seated 3 tables away, who had arrived separately and had spent the evening networking with exactly the donors his own consulting entity had helped defraud. Vivian Whitfield stood up so fast her chair fell backward with a crack that echoed across the East Room, and said, in a voice stripped of every ounce of the composure she had spent 63 years constructing, "This is a mistake. This is clearly, obviously a mistake. Do you have any idea who we are?" And it was in that exact moment, watching her, that I finally understood the full, complete shape of the phrase she had used on me 40 times across 9 years. Because I turned to her, quietly, calmly, in front of 240 witnesses, a Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, a 4-star general, and a room full of cameras that would replay this exact exchange 900 million times across the following month. And I said, "Some people simply were not raised to understand certain things, Vivian. I've heard you say that so many times. I think tonight, finally, you might understand what it means." Preston said nothing at all, sitting frozen in his ill-fitting tuxedo while an agent read him his rights, his face the specific blank white of a man who had spent 31 years believing consequences were things that happened to other people. Bradford Whitfield, still standing near the registration table entrance where the entire evening had begun, simply stared, his earlier bravado gone completely, replaced by the expression of a man watching a name he had spent 71 years believing was untouchable become, in real time, a headline. Nathaniel did not fight the handcuffs. He stood, quiet, pale, and as Agent Castillo turned him gently by the shoulder to walk him from the room, he looked back at me one final time across the East Room, past the crystal chandeliers, past the string quartet that had gone completely silent, past 240 guests who would spend the rest of the night unable to think about anything else, and he said one sentence, the only thing he said to me that entire evening, 5 words that I have turned over in my mind every single day since. "How long have you known?" I did not answer him with a number, though I could have told him exactly. 334 days, from a cold mug of coffee at 8:52 on a Thursday morning to a barcode scanner at a registration table under White House floodlights. I simply looked at him and said, "Long enough to do it right," and watched 2 federal agents walk my husband out of the East Room in handcuffs, while a room full of strangers who had known me for exactly 40 minutes as a Treasury Department honoree finally understood exactly whose family they had just watched collapse. I did not go home with the rest of the guests that night. I sat instead in a small anteroom off the East Room, still holding a crystal award I had almost forgotten I was carrying. While General Bardsley brought me a glass of water I did not drink, and Agent Castillo, finished processing the initial paperwork on 4 simultaneous arrests, came to sit across from me for exactly 6 minutes, the longest single conversation we ever had in person. "It's done," she told me. "The rest is going to be slow. Arraignments, discovery, motions, probably 18 months before anything goes to trial, assuming none of them plead. But the part that needed to happen tonight has happened. You can exhale now, Ms. Marlowe." I remember laughing at that, a short, strange laugh, because I had not realized until she said it how long I had been holding my breath. Not for one evening, but for 334 days. The news broke before I even left the building. A junior White House correspondent who had been covering the recognition dinner as a minor social item, the kind of 2-paragraph filler story that runs below the fold on a slow news day, had witnessed the entire arrest from 12 feet away, and by the time I walked out of the East Executive Avenue entrance at 11:15 that night, the story already had a headline running across 3 major outlets. "Foundation heirs arrested at White House gala in $200 million fraud scheme." By morning, it had my name in it too, though not the way I expected. Not as the wife, but as Treasury forensic accountant honored hours before husband's arrest. A framing that General Bardsley later admitted, with something close to satisfaction, he had personally suggested to a press liaison he trusted, specifically to make sure the story could never be told any other way. Camille Duval learned about the arrest the same way most of the country did, from her phone, at roughly 10:30 that night, according to a detail I only learned much later from an unrelated civil filing. She did not attend the dinner. Her name had never been on any official guest list, only Roland Pierce's consulting entity's internal event roster. And by the time federal agents executed the search warrant on the Beacon Hill townhouse 11 hours later, she had already retained an attorney, already begun cooperating, fully, immediately, without hesitation, with prosecutors in exchange for a proffer agreement that would, months later, keep her out of prison entirely, in exchange for detailed testimony about the Harborview Discretionary Trust's origins. I want to be honest with you, I felt almost nothing when I learned this. Not vindication, not anger, just a flat, distant confirmation of the exact trait I had watched define her across every interaction I ever witnessed: opportunism, total and consistent, applied now to surviving the collapse of the very structure that had built her entire life, exactly as fluidly as she had once applied it to occupying that structure in the first place. The one thing I insisted on, through General Bardsley, through a careful conversation with Agent Castillo, was that any plea agreement include an ironclad provision sealing all records related to Theodore Duval's identity, and that provision held completely, permanently, and I have never once regretted fighting for it. I moved out of the McLean house 9 days after the dinner into a 2-bedroom apartment in Arlington I found through a colleague at Treasury, close enough to walk to work, small enough that I could clean it myself in under an hour, which mattered more to me in those first weeks than almost anything else. A life-sized version of control, in a period where everything else felt like it was happening to me, rather than because of me. I brought 4 boxes of books, my grandmother's sewing machine, the mug that said "World's Okayest Accountant," and almost nothing else, because I discovered, standing in that empty, half-furnished apartment on my first night alone, that I did not actually want a single object from 9 years of a marriage built on a foundation I now understood, literally and figuratively, had never been real. The legal process took, in the end, almost exactly as long as Agent Castillo had predicted that night in the anteroom, 16 months from the sealed indictment's public unsealing to the final sentencing hearing, 16 months during which I testified twice before a grand jury reviewing the full scope of Ashford Meridian's client list, sat for 11 hours of deposition with defense attorneys who tried, exactly as General Bardsley had warned me they would, to paint my initial investigation as the vindictive project of a jealous wife, rather than the methodical work of a trained forensic examiner, and watched from a careful, professional distance as the case against Roland Pierce, Vivian Whitfield, Preston Whitfield, and Nathaniel Whitfield moved through a federal courthouse in Alexandria that I had, for 8 years before any of this began, walked past on my way to work without ever once imagining I would testify inside it. Roland Pierce broke first, exactly the way I had privately predicted to Agent Castillo 11 months into my own investigation. back when I was still building the entity map alone at my kitchen table. Facing the combined weight of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that carried a maximum sentence of 30 years, Roland Pierce pled guilty within 4 months of the indictment's unsealing, in exchange for a sentencing recommendation of 7 years and a cooperation agreement that produced, according to court filings I was later permitted to review as a named victim in the case, over 4,000 pages of internal Foundation correspondence that closed nearly every remaining gap in the FBI's understanding of exactly how the Ashford Meridian structure had operated across 6 years. Roland Pierce was disbarred by the Rhode Island Supreme Court 11 weeks after his plea, a proceeding that took, according to the Bar Association's own public filings, considerably less time than most attorney disciplinary matters, because the evidentiary record was, in the words of the disciplinary panel's written opinion, unusually complete and largely undisputed. Preston Whitfield's case moved differently, and watching it unfold taught me something about consequence that I had not fully understood before that year, that some people, even facing overwhelming evidence, cannot help but remain exactly who they have always been, right up until the moment a judge takes away their ability to choose anything at all. Preston initially refused to plead, insisting through 2 different attorneys, the first of whom withdrew from the case after 4 months, citing irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy, which I understood, from experience, to mean that Preston would not stop trying to explain to his own lawyer that the $61,000 consulting salary was basically a normal industry rate. You'd have to ask someone who actually understands nonprofit compensation structures, that he had been an unwitting board member with no knowledge of the underlying fraud. This defense collapsed entirely when prosecutors introduced a recorded voicemail, subpoenaed from Roland Pierce's own office phone system as part of his cooperation agreement, in which Preston could be heard 18 months before the arrests, asking Roland directly whether the consulting thing could maybe bump up to 75. Since I'm basically running the olive oil launch off it at this point, a recording that made clear, beyond any reasonable dispute, that Preston understood with total precision exactly what the consulting arrangement actually was, and exactly how dependent his entire adult lifestyle had become on it. Preston pled guilty 9 months into the process, was sentenced to 3 years, and is currently incarcerated at a federal facility in Petersburg, Virginia, where, according to a single detail I learned secondhand through a mutual family contact and did not seek out myself, he has taken up work in the facility's small commissary, a job that pays, before deductions, 86 cents an hour. Vivian Whitfield fought the charges longer and harder than anyone else in the family, funding an extensive legal defense through assets that, by the time of trial, had been almost entirely frozen or seized by federal forfeiture proceedings, forcing her, in a detail that several news outlets covered with what I can only describe as undisguised relish, to sell both the Little Compton cottage and a smaller condominium in Newport at prices well below market value, in order to pay her own legal fees. Vivian's trial, she was the only defendant who ultimately took her case before a jury rather than accepting a plea, lasted 11 days, and I testified on the 6th, walking through the entity map I had built at my own kitchen table nearly 2 years earlier, now enlarged onto courtroom display boards, financial exhibit by financial exhibit, in a testimony that lasted just under 4 hours and that defense counsel, true to General Bardsley's prediction, spent nearly 90 minutes of cross-examination attempting to characterize as the work of a scorned spouse with a personal vendetta, an attempt the jury did not appear to find persuasive, given that every single document I discussed had been independently verified through public records, bank statements I was legally entitled to as a joint account holder, and subsequent FBI forensic analysis that matched my own findings within 3 percentage points of accuracy. Vivian Whitfield was convicted on 19 of 22 counts, sentenced to 11 years, and is currently incarcerated at a federal facility in West Virginia, a fact I learned not because I sought it out, but because a cousin of Nathaniel's, someone I had met perhaps twice in 9 years of marriage, reached out to me 8 months after sentencing, apparently under the impression that I would want to know, to tell me that Vivian had, during intake processing, reportedly informed a corrections officer that she was not accustomed to sharing a room, a detail that made its way back to me secondhand, and that I will admit, without any particular pride, made me laugh out loud, alone, in my Arlington apartment, for the better part of a full minute. Nathaniel took the plea agreement I expected him to take, roughly 10 months into the proceedings, admitting guilt to reduced charges of wire fraud and conspiracy in exchange for a recommended sentence of 6 years. a deal his attorneys negotiated in part by emphasizing his cooperation in providing testimony against Ashford Meridian's Cayman-based administrators, testimony that ultimately helped federal prosecutors secure additional indictments against 3 individuals in Georgetown, whom I had identified but never been able to fully document in my own original investigation. I attended his sentencing hearing, the only hearing across the entire 16 months that I attended, purely as a witness to the proceedings, rather than as a testifying party, sitting 4 rows back, and I watched Nathaniel Whitfield, in a gray federal detention jumpsuit, stand before a judge and read a brief allocution statement that mentioned, at one point, the family I've hurt, a phrase so carefully unspecific that I could not tell, and did not particularly care to determine whether he meant me, or Theodore, or both, or neither. He looked at me exactly once during the entire 40-minute hearing as marshals led him from the courtroom afterward, and I met his eyes without flinching, the same way I had learned to meet the eyes of 100 subjects across my professional career, and felt, for the first time in the entire 16-month process, something that was neither cold nor triumphant, but simply, quietly finished. It is now just over 2 years since that Thursday morning with the cold coffee and the blocked number, and 14 months since Nathaniel Whitfield's sentencing hearing, and I want to walk you through exactly where every person in this story ended up, because I promised you at the beginning that the consequences would be specific, and specificity is the entire reason any of this ever came to light in the first place. Nathaniel is currently serving his sentence at a low-security federal facility in Cumberland, Maryland, with an expected release date, accounting for good behavior credit, roughly 4 years from now. I have received, through my attorney, 3 letters from him over the past 14 months, none of which I have answered, not out of cruelty, but because I made a decision, early in this process, that closure did not require correspondence, and I have found that decision to be exactly as freeing as I hoped it would be. I do know, again through channels I did not seek out but that occasionally reach me anyway, that Nathaniel has taken a position within the facility's education program, tutoring other incarcerated men studying for their GED. A detail that I received with genuine complexity. Not forgiveness, not warmth, but something closer to a distant, professional acknowledgement that a person can hold both profound harm and small, real growth inside the same lifetime, and that neither one erases the other. Vivian Whitfield continues to serve her 11-year sentence in West Virginia. The Little Compton house sold, eventually, to a hedge fund manager from Greenwich, who, according to a local Rhode Island paper that covered the sale with a headline I found almost unbearably fitting, plans to restore the property to its full historic grandeur, a phrase Vivian herself might have used unironically 2 years earlier. Vivian's 40 times repeated phrase, "Some people simply were not raised to understand certain things," has, I am told by the same cousin who informed me of her intake comment, become something of a dark joke among a small circle of Newport socialites, who once considered themselves her closest friends and have not visited her, written to her, or mentioned her name publicly in over a year. Preston remains incarcerated in Petersburg, Virginia, with roughly 18 months remaining on his sentence. The olive oil venture, unsurprisingly, never secured its Series A. I learned, through the same secondhand family channel, that Preston has begun, during his incarceration, taking correspondence courses toward an actual accredited business certification. A detail that struck me when I first heard it, as either the beginning of something genuine or simply Preston's 5th attempt at a plan that sounds impressive at a dinner table. And I have decided, for my own peace of mind, that it is not my responsibility to determine which one it turns out to be. Roland Pierce is serving his 7-year sentence at a federal facility in Otisville, New York, permanently disbarred, and, according to public court filings related to a separate civil suit brought by several of the Foundation's original charitable beneficiaries, the Maritime Academy, the Children's Hospital in Providence, personally liable for a portion of the restitution owed to donors who gave in good faith to causes that never received the funds they believed they were supporting. That restitution effort, which I have followed closely, has so far recovered $41 million of the $209 million named in the original indictment, primarily through asset forfeiture on the McLean house, the Little Compton property, 3 vehicles, and a partial recovery from Ashford Meridian's frozen Cayman accounts, secured through an international mutual legal assistance treaty request that took, in total, just over a year to execute. The Children's Hospital wing that had borne the Whitfield Foundation's name for 6 years has since been quietly renamed, and the Maritime Academy Scholarship Fund, I was pleased to learn through a public announcement I had no involvement in whatsoever, has been reconstituted under new, independent trustee oversight, using recovered restitution funds, ensuring that the 11 students who had been receiving Whitfield Foundation scholarships at the time of the collapse did not lose a single semester of funding. I received, roughly a year after the restructuring was announced, a short handwritten note from one of those 11 students, a 19-year-old sophomore studying marine biology named Aisha Ferreira, forwarded to me through the Academy's new independent trustee because Aisha had apparently insisted on finding some way to reach whoever actually made sure I didn't lose my scholarship. And the note said simply that she had read about the case in her local paper, that she had not fully understood, before that, how something as abstract as a wire transfer or a shell company could reach all the way down into whether a 19-year-old from a fishing family in New Bedford got to keep studying the ocean she had grown up on, and that she wanted whoever it was to know that it mattered. I keep that note in the same desk drawer as the yellow legal pad and Preston's letter, not because it resolves anything about the larger case, but because it is, of every single document I collected across 3 years of this story, the one that most clearly answers the question I sometimes still ask myself on the hardest nights, whether 11 months of quiet, disciplined, unglamorous work was actually worth what it cost me personally to complete it. Camille Duval's cooperation agreement kept her out of prison entirely, as I mentioned earlier, though it did not keep her out of the Beacon Hill townhouse's lease, which terminated the month after the arrests once the Harborview Discretionary Trust's assets were frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. I do not know, and have deliberately not sought to learn, where Camille currently lives, what she currently does for income, or how she has explained the events of that year to Theodore, who would be 6 years old now, old enough, I imagine, to ask questions that Camille alone will have to find the words to answer. The sealed provision protecting Theodore's identity has held completely. His name has never appeared in a single news story, court filing summary, or public record related to this case. And I consider that, of everything that happened across those 2 years, one of the very few outcomes I am entirely, uncomplicatedly at peace with. And Bradford Whitfield, the man who told me, under White House floodlights, that I was not on the list. Bradford returned to Palm Beach 4 days after the dinner and, according to a brief item in a regional society publication, that a colleague forwarded me with a single laughing emoji and no other comment, resigned from 2 country club boards within the following month, citing a desire to focus on family matters during a challenging period. Language so carefully bloodless that I read it 3 times before I fully appreciated how much work it was doing to avoid the words, "My entire family was arrested at the White House." My own life, in the 2 years since that Thursday morning, has changed in ways I could not have imagined standing in my kitchen in a beige cardigan holding cold coffee. 6 months after Nathaniel's sentencing, I was promoted to Senior Financial Crimes Analyst within the Treasury Department's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, a position that came with a formal commendation citing, in language considerably less vague than the one read aloud at that White House dinner, exceptional independent analytical work that led directly to the disruption of a $200 million international money laundering scheme. I now lead a small team of 4 junior analysts, and I have made it a point, in every single training session I run, to tell them the same thing General Bardsley told me on the phone at 2 in the morning nearly 3 years ago, that the case matters more than the satisfaction of holding it yourself, that meticulous, patient, unglamorous documentation will always outlast a confrontation driven by anger, and that the moment you tip your hand, the evidence disappears. I bought a small house 11 months ago, not in McLean, but in a quieter neighborhood in Falls Church, a 3-bedroom colonial, with a garden I have slowly, imperfectly, been learning to keep alive. The first home I have ever purchased entirely with my own name on the deed and my own money in the down payment, a detail that mattered to me more than almost anything else I have accomplished in the past 2 years. I still have the mug that says World's Okayest Accountant. It sits in my kitchen cabinet in Falls Church, and I use it most mornings. And I have come to think of it not as a joke from a niece 4 Christmases removed from a marriage that no longer exists, but as a small, private monument to the version of myself who stood in a beige cardigan at 8:52 on a Thursday morning and decided, in 11 quiet minutes, not to confront, not to panic, but to build a case. General Bardsley and I still speak every week, sometimes more, a habit that has outlasted the specific circumstances that once made it necessary. He retired fully from his advisory role 8 months ago, and Margaret, his wife, has taken to inviting me for Sunday dinner roughly once a month. Dinners that bear absolutely no resemblance to the ones I once endured in Little Compton. No mint jelly commentary, no fixed traits performed on repeat. Just a retired general and his wife asking genuine questions about my garden, my team at Treasury, and, increasingly over the past few months, whether I have met anyone interesting, a question I answer honestly, which is to say, not yet, and I am, for the first time in my adult life, entirely unbothered by that answer, because I have finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, and I no longer confuse the two. I visited my father's grave at Arlington National Cemetery 3 weeks ago, on the anniversary of his death, a visit I make every year without fail, and for the first time in 20 years, I did not simply stand there in silence the way I always had. I told him everything: the foundation, the entity map, the 11 months, the White House, the barcode, Vivian's 40 times repeated phrase, Theodore, all of it. Out loud, alone, in the quiet of Section 60, on a cold morning, with my breath visible in the air, because I finally understood, standing there, exactly what General Bardsley had meant all those years ago when he told me the best way to honor Daniel Marlowe was to stay sharp, stay relentless, and never once let anyone convince me that the numbers didn't matter, simply because checking them was inconvenient for someone else. Here is the lesson I have taken from all of this, the one I think about more than any single detail of the case itself, more than the entity map, more than the barcode, more than the exact sound of Vivian's chair hitting the floor of the East Room. For 9 years, I let a man tell me not to check the math in my own house, and I want you to understand that the cost of that single, quiet agreement was not measured only in dollars, though it was measured in 209 million of them. It was measured in every dinner where I smiled at a mother-in-law who called my name like an insult, every Sunday where I watched a brother-in-law ask for money he had never once earned, every year I spent believing that the family takes care of things was an explanation rather than a warning. If there is one thing I would ask you to take from watching this, it is not the specific mechanics of shell companies or offshore trusts, though I hope those details were instructive. It is this: the moment someone you love asks you to stop checking your own math, in your own house, in your own life, is not a moment of trust. It is the moment the math has already stopped adding up, and the only question left is whether you are willing to spend 11 months finding out exactly how and exactly why before someone else finds out for you. How long would you have waited if it had been your kitchen table, your cold coffee, your blocked number at 8:52 in the morning? I have not yet told you about Marcus Webb, the Defense Contracting Program Officer whose $18,000 wire to Camille Duval was the very first anomaly I noticed, back in those earliest days before I even understood how deep the structure went. And I think you deserve to know how that particular thread resolved, because it turned out to be far stranger than I initially assumed. When I first found the wire, sitting at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad 6 weeks into my private investigation, I assumed it was simply another payment tied to Camille's personal life. Perhaps an unrelated relationship, perhaps a coincidence entirely outside the Whitfield structure. I flagged it, noted the date, the amount, and the description on Webb's own expense report, consulting services rendered, and moved on, because at the time I had bigger fish, namely $200 million of them, occupying my attention. It was not until Agent Castillo's team subpoenaed Camille's full financial records 11 months later that the truth of Marcus Webb's wire came into focus, and it was not what any of us expected. Marcus Webb, 41, was not romantically involved with Camille Duval at all. He was, according to records the FBI eventually pieced together, a defense contracting employee who had been separately approached by Camille roughly 2 years into her arrangement with Nathaniel, after she discovered, through casual conversation at a Whitfield Foundation gala, that Webb's employer held several government contracts requiring detailed compliance disclosures, and that Webb himself had access to internal vendor payment systems. Camille, entirely independent of Nathaniel, entirely on her own initiative, had begun operating a small side scheme, using her own Harborview discretionary trust as a landing point, in which she offered Webb consulting fees, really disguised kickbacks, in exchange for steering a small number of subcontracting opportunities toward a shell vendor she controlled. A scheme that, while dramatically smaller than the Whitfield Foundation fraud, at roughly $340,000 total across 2 years, constituted a wholly separate federal crime, procurement fraud, that Camille had built and operated entirely on her own, using skills and instincts I have come to believe, she developed specifically by watching, up close, exactly how the Whitfield family structure worked. I want to sit with that detail for a moment, because it recontextualized something important for me. Camille Duval was never simply a passive beneficiary of Nathaniel's fraud. a mistress collecting a townhouse and a monthly allowance. She was, by the time the full picture emerged, an active architect of her own parallel scheme, built using the exact same tools: shell trusts, consulting fee mischaracterization, relationships exploited for financial access, that she had watched Nathaniel and Vivian deploy for years. Her cooperation agreement, which kept her out of prison on the Whitfield Foundation charges, did not extend to the separate procurement fraud scheme once investigators uncovered it. Camille ultimately pled guilty to a single count of wire fraud related to the Webb kickback scheme 8 months after the original arrests, receiving 18 months of home confinement and a restitution order of $340,000, a sentence that, while far lighter than what Nathaniel, Vivian, or Preston received, was not, in the end, the total absence of consequence that I had initially, privately, resented when I first learned the terms of her original cooperation agreement. Marcus Webb, for his part, was terminated from his position and separately charged with accepting illegal gratuities in connection with federal contracting, receiving a sentence of probation and a permanent bar from holding any position requiring federal security clearance. A career-ending consequence for a man who had, according to court filings, spent 19 years building exactly that kind of career. This is the part of the story I think about more than almost any other detail, when people ask me what surprised me most across the entire investigation. It was not the $209 million. It was not the townhouse or the foundation or even Theodore. It was the discovery that fraud, once it takes root in a family structure, does not stay contained to the people who built it. It teaches everyone who watches it closely enough exactly how to build their own version. And Camille Duval, who I had spent months viewing purely as a passive symbol of Nathaniel's betrayal, turned out to be the clearest, most unsettling illustration of exactly how contagious that particular kind of dishonesty can become, once someone decides that watching it work up close is the same thing as earning the right to use it themselves. The ripple effects of the original case extended well beyond the Whitfield family, and I think it is worth walking through them, because they are the part of this story that most directly connects to the work I do every single day, and the reason General Bardsley insisted, from the very beginning, on routing everything through the FBI's International Corruption Unit and Treasury's own FinCEN division rather than allowing it to remain a narrow, contained family matter. Ashford Meridian Partners, the Cayman Islands intermediary at the center of the entire laundering structure, turned out, once fully investigated, to have serviced at least 9 other clients engaged in structurally similar schemes, ranging from a mid-sized real estate development firm in Texas that had been mischaracterizing investor distributions as consulting fees to avoid disclosure requirements, to a considerably more serious case involving a shell network used to route funds connected to sanctioned individuals in a jurisdiction I am still not permitted, under the terms of my own limited security clearance briefing, to name publicly. 3 separate federal indictments, entirely unrelated to the Whitfield family, were ultimately filed as a direct result of the broader Ashford Meridian investigation that began, however indirectly, with a yellow legal pad and a public 990 filing on my kitchen table. Ashford Meridian's founder and 2 senior partners were arrested in a coordinated operation involving Cayman Islands authorities and the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of International Affairs 14 months after the original White House arrests, and the firm itself was formally dissolved by Cayman regulatory authorities the following year. Its remaining client accounts frozen pending an ongoing multinational asset recovery effort that, as of this recording, has recovered an additional $63 million connected to victims entirely unrelated to the Whitfield Foundation. I was asked, roughly a year after the original arrests, to provide a closed briefing to a Senate subcommittee on banking and financial services, discussing, in broad and appropriately declassified terms, the specific structural vulnerabilities that had allowed a scheme of this size to operate undetected for 6 years. The ease of registering shell entities in jurisdictions with minimal beneficial ownership disclosure requirements, the gap between charitable foundation reporting requirements and actual forensic auditing capacity at the IRS, and the specific pattern of consulting fee mischaracterization that, once I described it in detail, 3 separate committee staffers told me privately afterward that they recognized from other cases entirely unrelated to mine. That briefing led, 8 months later, to a modest but genuine legislative proposal. Not one I take primary credit for, but one I am proud to have contributed testimony toward, tightening disclosure requirements for private foundation consulting arrangements exceeding $200,000 annually, a threshold that, had it existed 6 years earlier, would have flagged the Whitfield Foundation's consulting fee growth as an automatic audit trigger long before it ever reached $4 million a year. I was also, in the 18 months following the arrests, approached by no fewer than 6 literary agents, 3 documentary production companies, and 1 true crime podcast host with a following in the millions, each offering some version of the same proposition: tell your story, on the record, in detail, for a fee substantial enough that several of them assumed it would be an easy yes. I declined every single one. Not because I am uninterested in this story being told, you are, after all, currently listening to a version of it, but because every single proposal I received asked, in one form or another, for details about Theodore that I had spent enormous effort protecting. And I decided, early and permanently, that no amount of money or exposure was worth trading a 4-year-old boy's privacy for a more compelling narrative arc. I have told this story exactly the way I am telling it now, in my own words, on my own terms, leaving out precisely what needs to be left out. And I have found that decision, like so many others across these 2 years, to be one I have never once regretted. I think to fully understand why I was capable of doing what I did across those 11 months, you need to understand a little more about who my father actually was. Because I have mentioned him a dozen times in this story as a kind of guiding memory, and I want to give him more than that. Staff Sergeant Daniel Marlowe grew up in a small town outside Fayetteville, North Carolina, the son of a mill worker and a school cafeteria cook, and he enlisted at 18, not out of some grand patriotic calling, he told my mother once, but because the Army offered him a structure his own chaotic childhood had never given him, a schedule, a chain of command, a clear sense of what was expected of him, and exactly what happened if he failed to deliver it. He was, by every account I have gathered since his death, an almost obsessively meticulous soldier, the kind of non-commissioned officer who checked his equipment 3 times before every deployment, who kept a small spiral notebook in his breast pocket recording every serial number, every supply request, every detail his commanding officers might one day need, and that a less careful man would have trusted to memory. General Bardsley told me once, years after my father's death, that Daniel Marlowe was the only soldier in his entire command he had ever fully trusted to double-check his own work without being asked, because my father operated from a simple, unshakable belief that carelessness costs lives, whether on a battlefield or anywhere else, and that the discomfort of double-checking something was always, always smaller than the cost of getting it wrong. I did not consciously think about that belief while I sat at my kitchen table building an entity map by hand instead of trusting a cloud-synced spreadsheet. I did not consciously think about my father's spiral notebook while I insisted, against every instinct toward speed and confrontation, on documenting every single wire transfer with a bank routing number and a timestamp before drawing a single conclusion. But I understand now, with 2 years of distance, that I was doing exactly what he would have done, in the only language he ever really spoke, translated from a battlefield into a kitchen table. Meticulous, patient, unglamorous preparation. Because the alternative, moving too fast, trusting a version of events I had not personally verified, was a kind of carelessness he had spent his entire life teaching himself, and later teaching the young soldiers under his command, not to accept. My mother, Diane Marlowe, still lives in the same house outside Fayetteville where I grew up, and she was, throughout this entire process, one of only 3 people who knew the full truth before it became public. General Bardsley, Agent Castillo in her professional capacity, and my mother, who I called every single Sunday of those 11 months, at first to talk about nothing, and eventually, once I trusted myself to say it out loud without falling apart, to talk about everything. My mother never once told me to leave Nathaniel sooner, never once told me to confront him, never once second-guessed the pace at which I was building the case, because she, too, had spent 17 years as a soldier's wife, learning that some kinds of courage look like waiting, and some kinds of strength look, from the outside, exactly like patience. I want to tell you about the 6th day of Vivian's trial in more detail, because it is the single day across those 16 months that I still dream about, in the specific, replaying way that certain memories refuse to fully settle no matter how much time passes. I arrived at the federal courthouse in Alexandria at 7:40 that morning, 40 minutes before I needed to, because I have never once in my life been late to anything that mattered, and I sat alone in my car in the parking garage for 20 of those minutes, running through the entity map in my head one final time, the same way I had run through it 100 times before at my kitchen table nearly 2 years earlier. Ashford Meridian, Blackstone Ridge, Halloran Strategic, the Harborview Discretionary Trust, a recitation that had become, by that point, less a memory exercise and more a kind of prayer. I wore a charcoal gray suit that day, not the navy dress from the dinner, a deliberate choice, because I wanted the jury to see me as exactly what I was in that room. Not a wife, not a victim, but a professional forensic examiner presenting evidence. I was sworn in at 9:14 in the morning, and I spent the first 90 minutes of my testimony walking the jury through the Foundation's Form 990 filings, the consulting fee growth from $110,000 to $4,200,000 across 5 years, the 3 consulting entities and their registered agent addresses, using enlarged printouts of the same yellow legal pad diagrams I had drawn at my own kitchen table. Exhibits the prosecution had carefully, painstakingly recreated in professional courtroom display format, but that I recognized, in every line and arrow, as my own handwriting made permanent, made official, made undeniable. Vivian sat at the defense table throughout my entire testimony in a gray St. John suit, her hair immaculate, her expression carefully neutral in the specific way I recognized from 9 years of watching her perform composure for rooms full of people she wanted to impress. And she did not once make eye contact with me across 4 hours. Not during direct examination, not during the 90 minutes of cross-examination where defense counsel attempted, methodically and ultimately unsuccessfully, to suggest that my findings were the product of bias rather than rigor. It was only once during a 15-minute recess in the early afternoon that our eyes met across the courtroom, entirely by accident, as I returned from the hallway water fountain, and I watched something pass across her face that I had genuinely never seen in 9 years of knowing her. Not anger, not the practiced disdain she had aimed at me across 100 dinners, but something that looked unmistakably like fear. The specific fear of a woman finally understanding, 4 hours into a testimony she could not discredit, that the daughter-in-law she had spent 9 years dismissing as unworthy of her name was the single most credible, most devastating witness the prosecution had. I did not smile at her. I did not look away either. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, in a navy silk dress I had worn once before to a Treasury holiday reception, and never again until that exact night, holding a small crystal award I would later set on a bookshelf in Falls Church, beside a photograph of my father in uniform. And I let her look at me for as long as she wanted, because for the first time in 9 years, I finally had absolutely nothing left to hide from her. I simply held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, the same length of time Camille Duval had once held mine across a Foundation Gala ballroom, and then I walked back to the witness stand and finished my testimony. Because I had learned, across 9 years of marriage and 11 months of quiet investigation, that the most powerful thing I could ever do to Vivian Whitfield was not raise my voice, was not confront her, was not even win, it was simply continue, exactly as prepared, exactly as calm, exactly as unbothered by her opinion of me as I had trained myself to be for nearly a decade, until the facts themselves did every single thing that 9 years of her cruelty had never once managed to do, made her small. I mentioned earlier that Margaret Bardsley has taken to asking, roughly once a month over Sunday dinner, whether I have met anyone interesting. And I want to tell you about the one time, 4 months ago, when my answer to that question was not quite the same easy not yet I had given for over a year. His name is Julian, he is 38, and he teaches high school physics at a school in Arlington 2 blocks from a coffee shop where I had started going most Saturday mornings simply because the espresso was good and the noise level was low enough that I could read the newspaper in peace. A small, deliberate ritual I built for myself in the first months after moving into the Falls Church house, back when silence still occasionally felt less like peace and more like something I needed to actively practice tolerating. We started talking because he asked, one Saturday, whether the seat across from me was taken, and I said no, and he sat down with his own coffee and a stack of ungraded lab reports, and we did not talk about anything of substance for nearly 6 weeks of parallel Saturday mornings. Just small, easy comments about the weather, about a dog that walked past the window every week at the same time, about nothing at all, which was, I have come to understand, exactly the kind of nothing I needed after 2 years of everything being enormous. I have not told Julian the full story. He knows I work at Treasury, in financial crimes. He knows I was married once and that it ended badly and that I do not particularly want to discuss the specifics. And to his enormous credit, in 4 months of slowly, carefully getting to know each other, he has never once pushed past that boundary, never once looked me up online to fill in the gaps himself, which I know he could have done in about 4 minutes given how thoroughly this story was covered in the press. I do not know yet whether I will eventually tell him everything, I do not know yet whether this particular relationship will last 6 months or 60 years. What I do know, and what feels after everything like its own quiet form of victory, is that I am no longer approaching a new relationship the way I spent 9 years approaching my marriage, assuming good faith by default, trusting explanations I never asked to see documented, telling myself that checking the math would be an insult to someone who loved me. I check things now, gently, appropriately, without paranoia, but I check them, and I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, that a genuinely honest person has never once flinched when I have asked a direct question and waited, patiently, for a direct answer. People ask me, more than almost any other question, whether I regret the 11 months I spent staying quiet, staying married, staying inside a house I already knew was built on lies, instead of simply leaving the moment I understood what Nathaniel had done. I have thought about that question more than any other across these 2 years, and I want to give you the most honest answer I have, because I think it matters more than the entity map, more than the barcode, more than any single detail of what happened in the East Room that night. I do not regret it, and here is why. If I had left the moment I received that first phone call at 8:52 on a Thursday morning, Nathaniel would have moved every dollar he could reach within 72 hours, exactly the way Agent Castillo confirmed to me was true of nearly every comparable case her unit had ever investigated. Vivian would have retained an army of attorneys before a single subpoena was ever issued. Camille would have disappeared into another arrangement, another wealthy family, another 6-year cycle of exactly the same opportunism I watched define her. This time with no forensic accountant 3 miles away, quietly building a case against her. Theodore's existence might never have surfaced at all, which would have meant a 4-year-old boy growing up entirely unprotected by the specific legal provisions I fought to secure on his behalf. And $209 million, donor money, charitable money, money meant for a children's hospital wing, and 11 scholarship students at a maritime academy, would have simply vanished into an offshore structure sophisticated enough to survive exactly the kind of hasty, emotional confrontation that leaving immediately would have triggered. Staying quiet did not mean staying weak. I want you to hear that distinction clearly, because I have spent 2 years watching people misunderstand it, both in the comment sections of every single article written about this case, and occasionally, more painfully, from well-meaning friends who could not understand why I did not simply throw a plate at Nathaniel's head the moment I found out and walk out the door. Staying quiet meant staying disciplined. It meant treating my own marriage with the exact same rigor I would treat a federal subject, because I understood, better than almost anyone else could have, that rigor is not the opposite of feeling. It is simply feeling channeled into something that actually produces justice instead of merely producing catharsis. I got both in the end. I got the catharsis, standing under White House chandeliers, watching a woman who called my name like an insult finally understand what those 40 repetitions of her favorite phrase actually cost her. But I only got that catharsis because I was willing, for 11 months, to sit with the much harder, much less satisfying discipline of simply building the case first and feeling everything else second. I think about the beige cardigan a lot, the one I was wearing that Thursday morning, the one I bought at a consignment shop for $31 because I have never in my life needed expensive things to feel like myself. I still own that cardigan. It hangs in my closet in Falls Church, and I have never once considered getting rid of it, because I have come to think of it not as a symbol of who I was before I knew the truth, small, underestimated, easy to dismiss at a family dinner table, but as a kind of uniform I wore into the exact moment my entire life changed. And I would rather remember, every single time I see it, that the woman wearing it was already, quietly, unmistakably, exactly as capable as she needed to become. I have one more memory of General Bardsley I want to share before I close this out, because I think it explains, better than anything else I could tell you, exactly why I trusted him with the single largest secret and the single largest risk of my entire life. When I was 13 years old, 2 years after my father died, I was struggling badly in school. Not academically, but socially. The specific isolation of being the girl whose father died a hero, a status that somehow made other 13-year-olds treat me like a museum exhibit rather than a person. And I stopped talking almost entirely for the better part of a semester. My mother, worried, mentioned it to General Bardsley during one of his regular calls, and 2 weeks later, without any warning, he drove 4 hours from Fort Bragg to Fayetteville on a Saturday, showed up at our door in civilian clothes, and asked if I wanted to help him with something. He had brought, from his own office, a box of unclassified logistics reports he claimed he needed help organizing, and he sat with me at our kitchen table for 6 hours, teaching a grieving 13-year-old how to sort, cross-reference, and reconcile supply manifests, not because he actually needed the help. I understood decades later, but because he had noticed that the only time I seemed to come alive that year was during the 2 months I had spent, the previous summer, helping my mother organize our family's tax documents after my father's death benefits paperwork became unexpectedly complicated. He gave a grieving child a structured, meticulous task with a clear beginning and a clear end, at exactly the moment she needed one most, and he came back nearly every month for the following year to do it again, small box after small box, until the semester ended and I was, by every measure that mattered, myself again. I did not fully understand, until I was building an entity map alone at my own kitchen table nearly 20 years later, that General Everett Bardsley had spent an entire year of Saturdays teaching me the exact skill that would eventually save my life. He never once said it that directly. He never once framed those Saturdays as anything other than a retired man's kindness toward an old friend's daughter. But I think about those 6-hour sessions at our kitchen table nearly every single day now, and I understand, with total clarity, that the woman who sat calmly at her own kitchen table nearly 2 decades later, building a case against her own husband with nothing but a yellow legal pad and total, disciplined patience, was not born the day she received that phone call. She was built, slowly, deliberately, one Saturday at a time, by a man who understood that the best gift you can give a grieving child is not comfort alone, but the specific, structured confidence that comes from being trusted to do something difficult and do it correctly. I have started, in the past year, doing something similar for the junior analysts on my own team at Treasury, and I did not consciously connect it to General Bardsley's Saturdays until a colleague pointed it out to me over lunch 6 months ago. There is a young analyst on my team, Priya Chandrasekaran, 26 years old, sharp in the specific quiet way I recognize because it was once my own way, and I have made a point, over the past year, of giving her the most tedious, most meticulous parts of every case we handle, the entity reconciliation. The timeline cross-referencing, the parts most junior analysts find boring compared to the excitement of an eventual raid or arrest, because I want her to understand, the way General Bardsley once made sure I understood, that the unglamorous work is not a lesser part of justice, it is the entire foundation of it. Priya closed her first major case 4 months ago, independently, using an entity mapping technique I taught her that traced almost exactly, though she does not know this, back to a yellow legal pad on my own kitchen table 3 years earlier, and when she came into my office afterward, practically vibrating with the specific pride of someone who has just discovered they are capable of something they did not fully believe they could do alone, I understood, watching her, exactly what it must have felt like for General Bardsley to watch me testify for 4 hours in a federal courtroom. Calm, prepared, and utterly unshakable. I read the comments on this channel, all of them, every single video, and I know that a good number of you are going to ask, in the comments below this one, whether I ever received any confirmation that Theodore was doing all right, given how much of this story revolves around the boundary I fought to draw around his privacy. I want to answer that honestly, within the limits of what I am actually permitted and willing to share. Once a year, through my attorney, who coordinates with a court-appointed guardian ad litem, who was assigned during the original custody and financial disclosure proceedings related to the Harborview Discretionary Trust, I receive a single sentence, nothing more, confirming that Theodore is healthy, enrolled in school, and being cared for appropriately. I do not receive photographs, I do not receive updates on Camille's personal life, her employment, or her whereabouts, and I have never asked for any of it, because the entire point of the boundary I fought for was to ensure that his life continued as privately and as normally as possible, entirely outside the reach of a story that was never his to carry. I received that single sentence 4 months ago for the 3rd consecutive year, and I sat with it for a long moment at my kitchen table in Falls Church, the way I sit with very few things anymore. And then I closed the message, made myself a cup of coffee, and went on with my day, because that, in the end, is exactly the outcome I was fighting for all along. A life ordinary enough, private enough, and untouched enough by any of this that a single confirming sentence, once a year, is genuinely all there is to say. I want to tell you about one more thing before I let this story end, because it happened exactly 1 week ago, and it feels like the right note to close on. I was at my kitchen table in Falls Church on a Sunday morning, the same table where I once built an entity map by hand across 11 quiet, terrified, disciplined months. And I was going through a box of old files I had finally decided to sort through, nearly 3 years after everything began, because a person can only avoid a single cardboard box in the back of a closet for so long before curiosity outweighs reluctance. Inside, beneath a stack of old tax returns and a folder of documents from a marriage that no longer exists, I found the original yellow legal pad, the very first one. Its pages soft and slightly curled from 3 years of storage. The handwriting on the first page slightly shakier than my handwriting is now. Dated a Thursday in October, 3 lines into an entity map that would eventually span 41 pages and take down 4 people at a White House gala. I did not throw it away. I do not think I ever will. I put it in a drawer in my desk at the Falls Church house. Not the closet, the desk. Somewhere I will see it regularly. Because I have decided that I want to remember, on the ordinary days as much as the difficult ones, exactly what a person is capable of building when she decides, quietly, at her own kitchen table, cold coffee going colder beside her, that she is done letting anyone tell her not to check her own math. I want to tell you about the first Monday I walked back into the Treasury building after the story broke nationally, because it taught me something about my own colleagues that I did not expect. I had worked in that building for 8 years by that point, quietly, competently, known mostly for being thorough rather than for being memorable, the kind of employee whose name appears reliably on case files rather than in hallway conversation. That Monday, walking through the security checkpoint at 7:50 in the morning, I noticed a stillness ripple through the lobby, colleagues glancing up from their phones, a few visibly recognizing my face from 100 news segments that had run over the preceding weekend, and I remember bracing myself, in the elevator, for exactly the kind of attention I had spent 11 months specifically trying to avoid. What I got instead, walking onto my floor, was something closer to quiet, professional solidarity. My direct supervisor, a woman named Diane Okafor, who had overseen my work for 6 years without ever once suspecting what I was building on my own time, met me at my office door, closed it behind us, and said only, "I read the unsealed filing this weekend. Every citation, every entity, every wire number. That's the most complete forensic case file I've seen come out of this building in a decade, and you built the entire foundation of it alone, on nights and weekends without a single Treasury resource, while married to the primary target." She did not ask how I felt. She did not offer sympathy I had not asked for. She simply said, "I'm recommending you for the senior analyst position the moment it opens," and left. And I sat alone in my office for a long moment afterward, understanding, for the first time, that the version of respect I actually wanted, earned, specific, professional, unrelated to pity, was exactly the version I had just received. Not every reaction was that clean. A colleague 2 cubicles down, a man I had worked alongside for 4 years, made an offhand comment in the break room roughly 3 weeks later. Something about, "Hope you kept better track of the marriage than you kept track of him." A joke delivered with the specific carelessness of someone who thought proximity to a dramatic news story entitled him to treat it lightly. And I remember the break room going completely silent, 6 colleagues looking at their coffee, waiting to see how I would respond. I did not respond with anger. I simply looked at him and said, "I kept track of exactly everything, actually. That's rather the entire point," and walked out. And I heard, secondhand, that he apologized to nearly everyone in that break room over the following week, mortified, though he never apologized directly to me, which told me everything I needed to know about the difference between genuine remorse and simple social embarrassment. I ran into someone from the old world exactly once, 4 months after the sentencing hearings concluded, at a restaurant in Georgetown where I had gone for a colleague's birthday dinner. A woman named Constance Ashworth Reyes, 61, one of Vivian's closest social companions for over a decade. Someone who had sat 2 seats down from me at no fewer than a dozen Whitfield Foundation events over 9 years without ever once addressing more than 4 words directly to me, approached my table near the end of the evening, visibly hesitant, and said, "Elena." I wanted to say, I had no idea. None of us had any idea. Vivian always made it seem like such a wonderful family. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had spent a decade watching Vivian call my name like an insult without once intervening, who had accepted invitation after invitation to a foundation that was, for years, actively defrauding real donors, and I said, simply, "I understand." It's easy to believe a story when the person telling it has spent a lifetime perfecting how to tell it. She did not quite know what to say to that, and after a moment she offered a small, uncomfortable nod and returned to her own table, and I finished my dinner in genuinely good company, surrounded by people who had never once needed a barcode scanner and a 4-star general to understand exactly who I was. Preston wrote to me once, roughly 10 months into his sentence, a single letter, 4 pages, forwarded to me through my attorney with a note asking whether I wanted it delivered or returned unopened. I chose to read it, mostly out of the same forensic curiosity that had driven the entire investigation in the first place. I wanted to see, in his own handwriting, whether the man who had asked me for a bridge loan 3 separate times across 9 years had actually changed, or whether incarceration had simply given him a more sophisticated vocabulary for the exact same entitlement. The letter described his correspondence coursework, his plans for an actual legitimate business, this time I promise L, nothing like the olive oil thing, and, in its final paragraph, an apology that read, on close forensic examination of its own careful phrasing, almost entirely as an apology for getting caught rather than an apology for what the getting caught had actually cost. The Maritime Academy scholarship students, the Children's Hospital wing, 11 years of Vivian's freedom, 6 years of Nathaniel's, my own marriage, and, quietly, permanently, whatever version of childhood Theodore Duval might have had if none of this had ever needed to happen. I did not respond to the letter. I filed it the way I file everything, carefully, without emotion, in a folder I keep in the same desk drawer as the original yellow legal pad. Not because I intend to use it for anything, but because I have learned, across 3 years of this story, that some documents are worth keeping simply as an accurate record of exactly who a person was, at exactly the moment they wrote something down, regardless of who they eventually claim to have become. I think about forgiveness sometimes, late at night, the way I imagine most people who have lived through something like this eventually do. I do not think I have forgiven Nathaniel, not in the complete, warm, reconciliatory sense the word usually implies. I do not think I have forgiven Vivian at all, and I am, at this point, entirely at peace with that. But I have arrived, slowly, at something I would describe less as forgiveness and more as release. A genuine, functional indifference to what happens to any of them next. An indifference that took nearly 3 years to build and that I consider, honestly, one of the harder accomplishments of this entire story. Harder in some ways than the entity map itself, because you cannot subpoena your way to emotional peace. You simply have to keep living, keep building your garden in Falls Church, keep drinking coffee out of a mug that says world's okayest accountant, keep showing up for Sunday dinners with people who ask genuine questions about your life instead of performing judgment about your shoes. Until one day, without any specific dramatic turning point you could point to on a calendar, you simply notice that the weight you used to carry into every single room has quietly, permanently set itself down. It is a Tuesday evening as I record this, almost exactly 3 years to the week since that first block number phone call, and I am sitting at the same kitchen table in Falls Church where I found the yellow legal pad in that cardboard box, wearing, because I decided this morning that it felt appropriate, the same beige cardigan I bought at a consignment shop for $31 nearly a decade ago. It still fits. It has a small pull near the left cuff that I have never bothered to mend, a tiny flaw I have grown oddly fond of, because it is the exact kind of imperfection Vivian Whitfield would have noticed instantly and commented on within 4 seconds of walking through my door, and I find a small, private satisfaction every single time I put it on, in wearing something imperfect and completely unbothered by who might judge it. My coffee tonight is not cold. I made sure of that, deliberately. A small piece of theater for myself as much as for anyone watching this. It is warm and it is good, and I am drinking it slowly, in a kitchen that belongs entirely to me, in a house with my name alone on the deed, 3 years and one entity map away from a woman who once let a man tell her not to check her own math. I think about General Bardsley's voice on the phone at 2 in the morning, telling me I had done it right. I think about my father in a burning vehicle in Fallujah, and a spiral notebook full of serial numbers no one but him ever thought to keep. I think about a 4-year-old boy I have never met, and will likely never meet, growing up somewhere I do not know, protected by a legal provision I fought harder for than almost anything else in this entire story, and I hope, genuinely, without complication, that he is having an ordinary, unremarkable, uneventful childhood, the exact kind of childhood that none of the adults around him managed to build for themselves. I think about Priya Chandrasekaran, 26 years old, closing her first case, vibrating with the specific pride of discovering her own capability. The same pride I felt walking out of that federal courthouse in Alexandria after 4 hours on a witness stand that took down a woman who once told me, 40 separate times across 9 years, that some people simply were not raised to understand certain things. I understand plenty, Vivian. I always did. I was simply patient enough, disciplined enough, and quiet enough to let you finish underestimating me completely before I let you understand exactly how much. If you have made it this far, if this story kept you watching through every entity name, every dollar amount, every quiet Sunday dinner where I smiled at people who had no idea what I already knew, I want you to do one thing for me before this video ends. And it is not a big thing, it is the smallest possible commitment. The kind of commitment you have already, functionally, made simply by staying with me this long. Subscribe so you do not miss what happens next, because the story I am about to tell you, about a different woman, a different family, a different set of numbers that did not add up, starts in a strange and specific coincidence I promise you I did not plan. At a gala almost exactly like the one where I met Nathaniel Whitfield nearly a decade ago, standing alone by a shrimp cocktail table, about to make the single worst financial decision of her entire life. My mother flew up from Fayetteville for Nathaniel's sentencing hearing, the only hearing across the entire 16 months she attended in person, and she sat beside me in the fourth row, holding my hand exactly the way she had held it 20 years earlier, standing on our own front porch, watching a young colonel in dress uniform walk up our front walk to tell her that her husband was not coming home. She did not say much that day. My mother has never been a woman of many words, but afterward, in the parking garage, she turned to me before we got into separate cars and said, "Your father would have hated every single thing that man did to you, and he would have been so unbelievably proud of exactly how you made him pay for it." And then she hugged me, hard, the specific hug she gives maybe twice a decade, and got into her rental car and drove to the airport, because my mother has also never been a woman who lingers in a difficult moment longer than the moment requires. She calls me every Sunday still, the habit we built during those 11 months of secrecy never quite dissolving even once the secrecy itself was gone. And our conversations now are almost entirely ordinary. Her garden, my garden, a recipe she saw on television, whether I have talked to Julian this week, whether Priya's case is moving forward, the specific, mundane texture of a relationship that survived the worst year of both our lives by simply refusing to stop showing up for each other every single week. 52 calls a year, for over 3 years now, 156 consecutive Sundays without a single one missed. I decided to make this video and the ones that will follow it, roughly 4 months ago, sitting at this same kitchen table, after a conversation with Julian where I mentioned, almost offhandedly, some detail about the entity mapping process, and he sat back in his chair and said, "You know, most people would not be able to explain any of that as clearly as you just did. Have you ever thought about actually telling this story all the way through, in your own words, the way you just told it to me?" I laughed at first, the same reflexive laugh I gave every literary agent and documentary producer who approached me in those first 18 months. But it sat with me differently, coming from him in my own kitchen, with no fee attached and no narrative arc being pitched to me. Just a genuine question from someone who had watched me explain something complicated with more clarity and more calm than most people manage discussing far smaller things. I thought about Priya, about the training sessions where I tell junior analysts exactly what General Bardsley once told me. I thought about every single person watching a video like this one, late at night, in a car during a lunch break they are not taking, wondering whether the numbers in their own life quietly stopped adding up somewhere they have been too afraid to check. And I decided, finally, on my own terms, in my own words, leaving out exactly what needed to be left out, that this was a story worth telling all the way through. There is one more thing I have not yet mentioned, something I debated including until the very last moment, and I am including it now because I think you deserve the complete picture. Not a curated version stopped just short of the parts that still feel unresolved. General Bardsley had a minor cardiac event 8 weeks ago, a blocked artery caught early during a routine physical, treated successfully with a stent, and a recovery his doctors describe as excellent for a man of 68 who spent 30 years of his life under the specific physical strain of active military command. He is fine. I want to say that clearly at the front of this before I tell you how it affected me, because I do not want you to worry the way I worried for the 11 hours between his own call telling me what had happened and the follow-up call from Margaret confirming that the procedure had gone exactly as planned. But I sat in the hospital waiting room in those 11 hours, in a chair not unlike the one I had sat in during 11 months of quiet investigation, and I thought about the fact that this man had appeared at my mother's door in dress uniform when I was 11 years old, had spent an entire year of Saturdays teaching a grieving child how to organize supply manifests, had driven to a courthouse to watch me testify, had stood beside me at a registration table under White House floodlights and said simply, "Ellie, there you are, we've been waiting for you." And I understood, sitting in that waiting room, with a specific, sudden clarity that arrives only when you nearly lose something you assumed would always be there. that I have never actually told him, in so many words, what those 30 years have meant to me. I have thanked him, I have called him every week, I have named him, repeatedly, across every version of this story I have ever told anyone. But I have never sat him down and said the specific, complete sentence I finally said to him 2 weeks ago, once he was fully recovered, sitting in his own living room with Margaret's hand on his shoulder. You did not just help me build a case, Everett. You built the entire person who was capable of building it, one Saturday at a time, starting when I was 13 years old and did not yet know I would ever need any of it. He did not say much in response. He is not, in the end, a man of many more words than my own mother. He simply nodded, once, and reached over and squeezed my hand, the exact same gesture he made walking me into the East Room nearly 3 years ago. And I understood that some things, between the right two people, do not actually require more words than that. I am telling you this now, at the very end, because it reminded me of something I want to leave you with. More than any entity map or barcode or courtroom testimony, the people who show up for you across decades, quietly, consistently, without asking for recognition, without needing the story to be dramatic to justify their presence in it, are worth more than every single dollar in that $209 million indictment combined. I built a case against fraud. General Bardsley, without ever once framing it this way, spent 30 years building the opposite of fraud in me. Total, verified, load-bearing trust. And it is that foundation, far more than any legal strategy Agent Castillo and the Department of Justice ever executed, that actually got me from a cold mug of coffee at 8:52 on a Thursday morning to a warm one on a Tuesday evening 3 years later at a kitchen table that belongs entirely to me. There is one final detail I have been sitting on throughout this entire recording, something I was not planning to mention until I sat down tonight and realized it was, in its own strange way, the most fitting possible place to end. 3 days ago, Agent Castillo called me, for the first time in almost a year, breaking, once again, every rule of the professional distance she has otherwise maintained since the case formally closed. She told me that a name had surfaced during an unrelated financial crimes review at Treasury, flagged by an automated anti-money laundering algorithm not unlike the one General Bardsley once used to obscure the original source of my own referral 3 years ago. A name connected to a private foundation in New York with an unusually rapid growth in its own consulting and advisory line item over the past 3 years. A foundation whose board included, among 5 names I did not recognize, a woman married into a family whose surname I did recognize instantly, because I had seen it, years earlier, on a guest list at a Whitfield Foundation gala, seated 2 tables away from where Camille Duval once poured champagne at my own wedding reception. Agent Castillo asked whether I would be willing to consult, informally, off the record, on the initial entity mapping, given how directly my own methodology from the Whitfield case had apparently already become something of an internal training model within her own unit. I told her I would need to think about it, though I think we both understood, by the end of that 4-minute call, exactly what my answer was eventually going to be. I have not yet requested the initial filings. I have not yet pulled up a public records portal at my own kitchen table. But I made myself a cup of coffee after I hung up the phone, and I sat here, at this exact table, for a long time afterward, looking at the drawer where I keep the original yellow legal pad, and I thought about a phrase I have said to every single junior analyst I have trained over the past 2 years. The moment someone tells you not to check the math is the moment the math has already stopped adding up. My phone buzzed again 40 minutes ago while I was recording the earlier sections of this video, a message from Agent Castillo that I have deliberately not opened yet, sitting on my counter right now. A single unread notification with a subject line that reads, in its entirety, initial entity summary attached. Thought you'd want the first look before anyone else does. The cursor is blinking over it right now as I speak. I have not opened it. I want to be honest with you about why, because I think it matters more than almost anything else I have told you tonight. It is not fear, and it is not hesitation in the sense of doubting whether I am capable of what comes next. I know exactly what I am capable of now. In a way, the woman in the beige cardigan 3 years ago did not yet know about herself. It is something closer to ritual. Every single case that has ever mattered in my life began with a moment exactly like this one. A blocked number at 8:52 in the morning, a yellow legal pad, an unopened envelope with a laminated credential inside it the night before a White House dinner, a single quiet pause, right before everything changes, where I let myself feel the full weight of what is about to begin, before I let myself begin it. I am sitting here right now, at this kitchen table, in the same beige cardigan, coffee going cold again despite my best intentions, staring at a notification I have not clicked, and something about the name in that guest list 3 tables away from Camille Duval is sitting in my chest exactly the way that first blocked number sat there 3 years ago, and I think, if I am being completely honest with you, that I already know I am not going to sleep tonight until I open it. So here is what I am going to do, and I am telling you this not as a plan but as something already decided, already moving, the same way every real decision in this entire story actually happened. Quietly, alone, at a kitchen table, before anyone else in the room had any idea it was underway. I am going to finish this recording. I am going to sit here for exactly as long as it takes to say the last few words I need to say to you tonight. And then I am going to open that email, alone, in this kitchen, with the same steady hands that once drew an entity map by hand across 41 pages of a yellow legal pad. And I am going to find out exactly whose name is sitting 2 tables away from a woman I once watched pour champagne at my own wedding. And whatever I find, I promise you, I am going to tell you every single detail of it the same way I told you every single detail of this one. Because I have learned, across 3 years and $209 million and 1 4-year-old boy I will never meet, that the truth is always worth building the case for, no matter how long it takes, no matter how many Sunday dinners you have to sit through first. My phone just buzzed a second time. Another message from Agent Castillo, 4 words only. Call me when ready. My hand is already moving toward the mouse, and I can feel my own pulse in my fingertips. You have sat here with me for the entire story of how I found $209 million hiding inside my own marriage, every wire, every name, every quiet Sunday dinner, which means you have already proven you are exactly the kind of person who needs to know how this next one ends. So subscribe right now, before you lose this tab, because the moment I open this email, I am opening it in the very next video, and I am not waiting for anyone who isn't already sitting right here with me when it